Good morning, everyone. When Falih Abdel Jabbar contacted me maybe 2 months ago about this project and the outcome, to present the outcome of this project, I was so delighted because I do remember a very interesting article of Satan Shami. She wrote it in 2010, arguing that every time we talk about ethnicity, we talk in relation to dominant group. It means that somehow there is no study of Kurdish community for itself and by itself, but because we want to see its problematic relationship to minority in the framework of minority majority. So I'm so glad that Falih Abdel Jabbar is with his team is conducting a long-standing research which will end up by this working day, governing diversity, Kurds in the Middle East after the Arab uprising. It was even, the date was set before the referendum, so I am sure that we will hear also some interesting analysis maybe about what is post-referendum crisis, if I put. So I give the floor now to Falih Abdel Jabbar. Yeah.
Thank you, Sari. I'm a bit disappointed because we have 4 other conferences. It looks like we are talking to ourselves now.
I would suggest that we should go to the library and herd them all in here.
No, it's okay. This project was thought of in 2013. At that moment, the Kurds were not on the map except in Iraq, prominently. Iran seemed dormant. In Syria, hardly any. Kurds were just taking part in the demonstration just like anybody else, looking forward for some kind of democratization from which they would benefit somehow, to get some cultural rights to speak their language, for example, or to use Kurdish names, they are denied these simple rights. In Turkey, there were secret negotiations between the PKK, that's the Kurdistan Workers' Party led by Abdullah Öcalan, and the mediator was a Kurdish party that was working legally. It's called the People's Party. The acronym is HDP. And their strategy was to work as part of the ruling party, the AKP, the Justice Party, led by Erdogan, which is an Islamic party. So when we started this, all like Kurds were not that important. But by 2014, and with the Battle of Kobani, or Ain al-Arab, was in September 2014. It was encircled, besieged by the Islamic State. The rise of the Islamic State and the war on terror that followed, the Kurds emerged in Syria, not only politically but militarily, and they emerged as a really genuine and effective force. And we had some Kurds parading themselves in Iran back into the mountains. So we had a conference to discuss these things and constructed this research. The research is representation of the Kurds. And the term representation is not a simple thing. It's a very complicated term and concept. I don't know who told me when I was young that simple things are very complex, complex things are very simple. Complex things can be dissected or into simple elements, but the simple elements are terribly complicated. And so representation we discovered that we have the representation of Kurds in the central government, in the host cities, as an ethnic group or a national group, however you name it. Then the areas where the Kurds are dominant, say in the KRG, that's the Kurdistan Regional Government in the Iraq, you have the people, how they are represented in their own government. So you have a dual kind of representation. And then you have non-dominant groups inside the Kurdish regions. And they face the same fate the Kurds face vis-à-vis the central governments of the host country. So it's a kind of a very intricate concept. So we had field examination, field research, reviewing the literature, and in the context of the current situation. I mean, the whole thing is now, it's not about history writing, although history is very important. The project covers 4 countries, Iraq and Turkey, Iran and Syria. Kurds are, I mean, large ethnic groups there. And if we believe some experts on this, that there is no one Kurdish nationalism, pan-Kurdish nationalism. There are Kurdish nationalisms in the plural, meaning Kurds of Turkey have a different kind of nationalism than that of Iraq or of Syria or of. So we had to examine these. Then we had to look at the problem from a sociological point of view, not only from political or constitutional, which are very important, but also from a sociological point of view. What do we mean by that? We have different classes. We have business classes. We have modern middle strata. I prefer to call them rather than middle classes. Then we have tribes. We have Sufi orders on the traditional aspect. Most of the leaders of the nationalist movements, at least in Iraq, hail from Sufi families and tribal families, some kind of kinship networks. And all these new forms of party politics and primordial solidarities, that primary solidarities of kinship, and they overlap. And when you look at political parties, you examine them as conduits, not only to represent their own people in the central government, but to see them as targets where people try to represent themselves inside these parties. And you look at the structure of the leadership, for example. You see the leadership is, in certain parties is drawn from a certain region, Al Jazeera, for example, in Syria, not Afrin or other areas. Or in Iraq, most of the leadership is from Soleimani, not Erbil or Duhok, or from Duhok, not from. So you see all these segmentary lines of city solidarity, religion, sect, tribe. They play their role and affect the construction of modern political parties in one way or another. So we had to examine all these and to examine the concepts of self-representation. We don't have one formula for all. It doesn't work that way. It's not in reality at all. We have autonomy. We have federalism. We have confederalism. We have decentralization. All these are forms of self-representation. And you see these forms have been evolved in time and are, in different places we have different concepts. So we had to examine all these things. And in the end, we had some survey. The survey really was focused on, it had 5 questions, apart from the biographical details, age, education, class, income, that sort of thing. Apart from that, we had only 5 questions, really. And the basic questions for me, I mean, as the director of this, was what sort of identity do they have? How do they see representation? What way? In what way? And which agency they pick up? And you'll be surprised to see that it's not the usual thing that certain parties would represent me. I pick up the Al-Hizb al-Jumhuri, the Republican Party, I pick up the Democratic Party or somebody else. It's not that. The choice is well beyond the politics of political parties. Some people think that they should be represented by their own tribe, or by their own clerics, or even by their own family. And some prefer even NGOs to represent them. They don't have confidence in other entities. And on the side of identity, which is very important, you think why do I want representation? Because I am a Kurd. And as a Kurd, I'm disfranchised. I'm not given the right to get represented as a, in brackets, as a minority. And even when I'm represented, minorities, demographic minorities always remain electoral minorities as well. They'll never have, if you follow this old rule of democracy as laid down by John Locke, it's the majority rule, majoritarian rule, the rule of the majority, and rule by consent. These are the two basic treatises put forward by John Locke in the 17th century. And it's still the norm. But in multi-ethnic, multi-religious societies where fracture lines between these communities are too deep to overlook, you can't simply follow the majority rule, because it will be the dominance of the majority group, majoritarian group. So always the Arabs are the majority in Iraq. Kurds are just 18%. Or the Shias are the majority among the Arabs, and Sunnis are always, and that means like one single group would monopolize power, and that's a disaster by modern norms. Why this is important? It has to do with the construction of nation states. This has to do with this. Nation states in our region emerged after the First World War. At that point, we had some political geographic units inherited from the Ottoman era, like Egypt, like Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, but not so in the Middle East. Absolutely not. Iraq was constructed in several different administrative units. Syria, the same. Palestine at one time was part of the a municipality that ran from Beirut, for example. And we look at this changing administrative units, and at one point you need to create states, at least, if not nation states, states-nations. That's states representing a community or something. The wisdom of nationalism is that every nation should have a state. And the self-determination principle emerged in 1914 with Lenin's writings on it. He wrote that for the peoples of the Russian Empire, anchored in the West European experience. Okay? 4 years later, 1918, we had Woodrow Wilson issuing 14 points, also embracing this same principle without stating the abstract pillars of that principle. What he suggested, if you read that, people talk about this document, nobody reads it, really. They read some summaries about it. Read it carefully. And you see, there is no mention of the basic principles of language. What's the nation, for God's sake? A group with one language, a group of one religion, a group of what? Woodrow Wilson didn't go into those details. He went into practicalities, just like all Americans. Kurds in this area should have this, Turks in this area. Yeah, and he was just talking geography and peoples. The principle is of nation state is that we know what state is. It's apparatus to rule and govern a certain territory, and it has legitimacy, it has the monopoly of means of violence, legitimate means of violence, etc. All these norms and characteristics of the statehood. But what's a nation? A group with one and the same language, or one and the same religion, as in Israel or Pakistan. One and the same race. The principle of race was used in Africa was against colonial powers. They had the same language, they learned French or English or whatever. So they didn't have like linguistic differential specifica, if you like. But for God's sake, there are 8,000 linguistic groups worldwide. We have only 200 states, which means that the multilingual, multi-ethnic states, these states are the rule, not the exception. And we have to learn how to, this is the dilemma of governing diversity. And it's still a dilemma. It will continue to be a dilemma. I'll stop just there because I took too much of the time. It should have been like 5 minutes, but I got too much. We have 5 volumes ready, almost ready. 2 of which are with the publishers, another 2 with the editors, just technical editing. And the 5th is yet to be completed. It's not complete. We hope that it will be complete. We hope to have it published with IB Taurus very soon. And this collection should provide some ample evidence as to the problems of the unitary state that we had constructed in the 20s of this century, of last century, and the problems that we have inherited from that unitary state, which will, as you can see in the case of Iraq, will continue to produce, to create problems time and time again. I'll stop just there and move to our topic. Rinad and I would do some assessment of the Iraqi case now. You all know that there's a crisis in Iraq, or there has been a crisis, still continuing. We had the referendum for independence in the KRG region, that's the Kurdish regional government, and beyond. There are other areas where the Kurds are the majority, and there was also some referendum was also done there in those areas beyond the limits of the Kurdish region. In my view, the Kurds of Iraq achieved something that none other Kurds have done. Really. Look at Turkey, look at Iran, look at, they were courageous, they were well organized, they were, they had a strong alliance with the leftist and democratic movement. There were so many factors. But what helped them in the end was the mass urban movements after the collapse of the state in 1991. And here we come to the unitary states is disintegrating in 2 countries. But they are formidable citadels of the past, defending the past, centralism in Turkey and Iran, assisted by new ideology, Islamism, Shia Islamism there, Sunni Islamism there. Okay, without further ado, I will talk now about the crisis. The general view is that the referendum in Iraq, there has been, for 8 months now, Masoud Barzani was talking about the referendum. It's not a new thing. Everybody knew about it. There were no reactions before the actual preparations to do the referendum. The explanation, the widespread explanation, which I disagree with, is that there was a crisis of presidency. His presidency had expired, and there was a constitutional problem, economic problems, and he wanted to get rid of it, to leap into the future, as the Arabs say, قفز إلى المستقبل. I disagree with this. The referendum was triggered by the conception, and I'm basing myself on interviews with the leaders. It's not my ideas, it's their ideas I'm analyzing. I'm not objectifying them, all right? In their view, the federal structures in Iraq failed because Iraq is a failed state. And one of the symptoms of this failure is the crisis between the KRG, that's the Kurdish regional government, and the federal government in Baghdad. At least of 2014, we had this economic sanctions and the collapse of the Iraqi army and the aftermath of it. And the Peshmerga, that's the Kurdish forces, took control over many disputed territories. So that's the basic thing, really. The basic thing was this, that this is a failed state, we must move forward. We must move forward. And the other conception they had in mind, if we do a referendum, the objective is either we reach for a confederal status, meaning as two sovereign entities, or at least we remove the sanctions at the minimum. So these were the two poles in their heads. But most people, during the agitation, propaganda, and mobilization, they moved their own, not only the emotions of the people, but their own emotions towards this maximum end, rather than, being cautious. The other objective that this kind of mobilization referendum would bring unity, because the Kurdish region is not unified. Even on the eve, I was 7 days before the referendum, I was there in Soleimani. You were there? You remember in the conference. And it was 18th September, only 7 days. And I wrote a note to many leaders, don't do the referendum, at least not now. They said, why? This is Ashura, for God's sake. Ashura, I'll talk about it later. So before talking about referendum, unify your own government. The KRG was not unified. In the middle of the road from Soleimani to Erbil, you have Daygala. Daygala is a small point where it's a checkpoint, a border point. And you had two administrations and two armed organizations, the Red Beret and the Green Beret, that's Erbil and Soleimani. How we go for nationhood when you don't have statehood? States are instrumental in creating nations, not the other way around. At least in the Middle East. In Europe, it's a different story. So unifying, getting confederalism, or removing the sanctions, these were the things in their head. And when faced with the questions that I raised, okay, now they said, we are very strong now. We have an army. We have a lot of modern weaponry through the war on ISIS, the Islamic Daesh, for short. And we have sympathy, we have this, we have that. I raised the question, what about Turkey? And the conception, again, the conceptions in their head, they have a lot of investment in us. They won't dare to invade. They wouldn't do that, because that's, they don't need to invade. Why should they invade? They just switch off the pipeline, you're dead. You have oil, you have nothing. There's no economy in Kurdistan. The countryside collapsed completely. We had the rural areas in Kurdistan were very rich in cereals, tobacco, this and that. It's all dead. 86% live in urban areas. And vast tracts of the richest meadows in the Middle East are gone dead. Okay, what about Iran? He said, they won't dare to invade us. The U.S.-Iranian tensions are too hot, and that would be, a good time for the Americans to punish the Iranians, so they wouldn't dare to. But they can move their proxies inside. They have the Hashd, Hashd al-Shabi, That's the Popular Mobilization Force. And again, I'm talking about the way they were seeing things. Then, what about the United States? They are urging you to stop your referendum. Everybody will, once we get independence, everybody will get accustomed to it. What do you mean you get accustomed to it? It's not a, you're not a thug, with muscles standing in the street and, imposing your will. This is the United States. They are your sponsors, in a sense, in many senses, really. We have a good lobby. Really, the lobby, it's the biggest lie in Kurdistan, I think. That's the greatest illusion, that self-illusion, if you like, that was created by the Kurds, for the Kurds, and none but the Kurds. Who's the guru of this lobby? Zalmay Khalilzad. He's known that a man who sells petrol, who defends, he represents oil companies, and he failed as an ambassador. He was sacked very quickly. He didn't even finish his term in his tour in Iraq. And what he assembled in Washington is a bunch of congressmen and ex-ambassadors. It's all retired. I mean, they are not even legislators, serving legislators. They are not in the executive. And even the child knows that, well, legislative power doesn't do foreign policy. They may have a say, they try to put some pressure, but they are not decisive. It's not theirs. And the executive power is telling you not to do that. Okay. Now, this is the mindset, really. About the timing, I had some discussions. Why you are doing it in Ashura? You know Ashura? The 10 days mourning of Imam Hussein. 12 million people take part in that. And these series of ceremonies and festivals, this and that. And 5 million on the 10th day. And it's the biggest mobilizing force in Iraq. The largest, the most emotive process of its sort. And everybody with the slightest inkling of wisdom wouldn't do anything during those days. You know why? Because it's well known that in Iraq, in Baghdad, we have two blocks. One block, we call it, metaphorically, of course, it's worse than the word, the right wing, Shi'i right wing, led by Maliki and the other groups. And they were agitating against the Kurds for the last 8 months, calling Kurdistan Kurdail, as Israel. From the very man who urged Talbani, the late President Talbani, why don't you take Mosul and take with you all the Sunnis and the Arab Sunnis, and let's get rid of them. He was ready to partition Iraq just to get rid of what you call the Sunni problem. That same guy is talking about this referendum as creating a new Israel. The last thing, and this is also the result of a discussion I had on the 19th. Look, in Baghdad, there are two blocks, as I said. One is the right-wing Shi'i bloc by Maliki, and the other is a centrist, led by Abadi. And the elections are coming next April 2018. And this guy is trying to build a political capital, relying on his successes in removing ISIS. And now you create a crisis for him, challenging him, drawing him into a battle against the Kurds, if you like, in Kirkuk and other areas. And if he doesn't react, he would be very weak. If he reacts, you would pay the price, nobody else. Why don't you let him, build his base and go for the elections, and after the elections, do the referendum? That was my proposal. Give the man a chance. In the end, you have to go to Baghdad to negotiate. Which is better, to negotiate with the war bloc, the war party, or the centrist, somehow less belligerent party? It's your choice. And then the American letter to them was read. We were a group of visitors, and I was among them, and one of the guys who attended this meeting in the parliament read the American letter, and it specifically said, give us a chance. We need to stabilize Iraq. We have war on ISIS. We have other challenges. We have this and that. They were urging them. Okay? They didn't pay attention. Okay, if you want the US to support you, you have to see, at least from the practical point of view of politics, you have to see their strategy. Why do you go on a collision course against this strategy? And this strategy, I think, apart from the American support, it's beneficial to Iraq, in a sense. And everyone knows that there was an Iranian-American confrontation about this. The Iranians are pushing the other wing, and the Americans are pushing this wing. The Americans are supporting the army. The Iranians are supporting the Hashid, and so on. That was the battle. And you just pretend or put a blind eye to all these developments. That's not politics. That's kind of stubbornness. That's arrogance. That's a very naive arrogance. So the only good thing that in this whole episode is the gradual shift in the discourse, in the national discourse of the Kurds, from ethnic, language-based discourse or conception of nationalism or Kurdishness into a kind of territorial nationalism or state nationalism, where the term Kurdistani was used as a geographical term rather than an ethnic term, under which all non-Kurds, Kurds and non-Kurds, live. And if this is your concept, I mean, this is the very concept that King Faisal had in 1924, that Iraqism is not an ethnic thing, it's a territorial thing. And, Kurds, Turkmen, Muslims, Shias, Sunnis, Jews, Christians can live. That's the basic, the original concept of state nationalism. And state nationalism, I think, is the best framework to go forward, provided that we have genuine democracy, provided that we have a fair distribution of resources. Otherwise, we will go nowhere. This is the conclusion that I drew from this whole project. And as I said yesterday, I mean, it was the most intellectually rewarding for me, and the least financially so. I'll stop just there and give the floor to Rinat. Rinat, sorry, I've taken too much time, perhaps.
Okay. Thank you. I'll be brief. Okay. Hey. Thank you. So when we started this project, not many people, particularly in the West, knew who the Kurds were or what the Peshmerga was. The IDRC approached us and said, we want to do a research project on governing diversity. And a lot has changed in the last 4 or 5 years in many of the different contexts: Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and even Iran to some extent. So it's been interesting to be able to monitor and follow this whilst doing surveys on the ground and speaking to the people. But the topic that this panel is on is the referendum. And so I suppose what I'll do is I will kind of use the research we've done to kind of talk a bit about referendum, particularly on the issue of representation, and also the international community. The international community, whatever you call whoever it is, doesn't like to recognize new states anymore. It doesn't. It's not a thing. You have a definition of what a state is. Those definitions are de facto definitions. If you have a territory, a population, Montevideo territory, population, a government, and the ability to engage in foreign relations. The Kurds of Iraq have that, right? What they don't have is what's known as de jure, which is juridical, which is recognized by the sort of international community because they don't like recognizing new states. So really, what the referendum shows is that that norm in international relations is still very strong. Now, what the Kurds had done well, and what I'll talk about today, what the Kurds have done well is maneuver around that norm until the referendum. The referendum represents to me a departure from what has otherwise been quite a pragmatic policy, moving sort of within those structures. More generally, when we look at the reasons why Kurdish movements emerge, it's easy to talk about structures, right? So in Iran, the Kurds are the weakest because the regime has killed their leaders, right? Assassinated, both in the Middle East but also in Europe. In Turkey, this idea of Turkish nationalism has been quite strong in suppressing what is the Kurds. But in Syria and Iraq, the withdrawal of the unitary state, the collapse of that centralized state, has given the space for these movements to emerge, particularly in Iraq after 1991 and in Syria after 2011. So the question is, the referendum was a departure from what I say is the Iraqi Kurds, the Kurds of Iraq, their foreign policy and diplomacy. Why was it a misstep? I think there are three key reasons why it was a misstep, and Falih already sort of mentioned them, so I'll briefly get into them. First of all, the Kurds, I think, prematurely gave up on Baghdad and on Iraq. So if you look at, after 2003, the Kurdish policy was to send senior leaders to Baghdad to be part of the Iraqi government to influence the state from within, right? The president was Jalal Talabani, a very senior head of the PUK, very famous, and he just recently passed away, but a monumental leader.
For the translator.
Sorry?
Slow down for the translators. Can't catch up.
Afu. Yeah, so they weren't. Jalal Talabani, the president, was not anymore in Baghdad. Hushar Zebari, another senior Kurdish KDP official, was the foreign minister. Baram Saleh, a senior PUK official, was the deputy prime minister. What I'm trying to say is the Kurds were part of the Iraqi government, and they were able to influence the Iraqi government, right? So in 2005, the constitution that was created is very friendly to the Kurds. And that's why the Kurds continue to refer to the constitution, because they drafted it. The Kurds were one of the two builders of the new Iraq with the Shia. And because of that, they were able to increase their autonomy as being part of Iraq. By 2017, the only senior leader in the Iraqi government is Fuad Mahsoum, the president, who's not even a Politburo member of his party, right? Clearly, just complete neglect. When Hushar Zebari last year was impeached, the finance ministry was left open, and the Kurds decided we don't need to fill it. We're giving up. Now, I think consequence of the referendum is this inability of them to influence the government, but also to understand what's going on in Baghdad, right? There's been this kind of this misinformation, and there was one particular factor, variable, that I think the Kurds really miscalculated, which is the Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi's relationship with the US, right? Abadi has proven to the US and to Saudi Arabia and to Jordan that he is not a pro-Iranian proxy. And he's trying to push back against what is Iranian hegemony and Shiism as a monolithic group in Iraq. So what happened is in 2015, for example, we talked about it. We saw this in the battle to retake Tikrit. Until that point, it was the Hashid and Iran who were on the front lines. By the way, Masoud Barzani also admitted in 2014 that Iran saved the Kurdistan region. It was the first actor there to provide both logistical support as well as tactical support, right? So, and this is when Turkey, sort of the patron of the KRG, had withdrawn. So Iran was the first actor to kind of push back against Daesh as it was threatening both Erbil and Baghdad. But in 2015, what Abadi decided to do was to invite the Americans and the coalition into the fight against Daesh. Against much to the rejection of Iran. Iran was upset. Iran withdrew from Tikrit in protest. But from there, Abadi began to set this precedent, which is balancing one off of the other, right? Looking to use the US and Iran he needs them both, but he also views them both as foreign countries, right? Now, what the Kurdish leadership didn't realize was they can no longer go around saying we're the only anti-Iran group. This is the kind of the policy line they would do in Washington. We're anti-Iran because the Prime Minister of Iraq is also telling them the same thing. So they lost that niche, right? Now, within the sort of structural community, the Prime Minister of Iraq will always be more important to the State Department and to many in Washington versus the president of the region. So that was a misstep. Another misstep, and we'll get into this history, that was quite consequential, was the failure of the KRG itself. For the longest time, the Kurdistan region's diplomacy was to paint this picture of an other Iraq, a democratic Iraq, an anti-Iran Iraq, but also a modernizing Iraq, right? How can you be democratic if your parliament hasn't convened for 2 years, right? This is the institution that represents the voices of the people. How can you be democratic if economic mismanagement has led to money not trickling down to the population, yet creating an elite across Erbil and Slamania, by the way? So really, what I started to see in London and in DC was this idea of an other Iraq falling on deaf ears, right? I mean, they're not dumb. American diplomats aren't dumb. If Zalmay Khalilzad goes to them and says, we have a democracy here, it's easy to go and see how democratic it actually is at the moment, right? So this was all contingent on Iraq being worse, right? As long as Iraq was a failing state, the Kurds could say, we're the other Iraq and we're better, even though we're moving, we have our own problems of corruption and everything. But what happened is actually, over the last year or so, Haider al-Abadi has built the Iraqi state. He's trying to rebuild it. He's taken back so much territory, 1/3 he's recovered from Nouri al-Maliki, who lost it. 2014 was an embarrassing year for Iraq, but 2017 was a year where Iraqis began to feel again that their institutions are there. If you look at polls done, and I mean, one would question surveys being done in Iraq at the moment, but surveys being done and also our fieldwork on the ground suggests that Iraqis have a renewed sort of trust in the army, for example, right, which was completely gone in 2014. So these are trends that kind of were important as context for this referendum, right? Iraq was on its way up. The Kurdistan region was a fledgling, and unable to really kind of suggest the things that they were suggesting. The other thing that, the other question that I think is still worth noting on the referendum, okay, misstep, no misstep. Was it inevitable, right? And this is a big question. Would Kirkuk have been taken anyway at some point, right? Okay, Rex Tillerson offered a deal for 1 year, for a 2-year negotiating process between Erbil and Slemania, after which the UN would agree if negotiations didn't succeed. The quote was the US would recognize the need for a referendum, right? So, I mean, this was a monumental deal that was not taken. In any case, would this have happened anyway? And many sort of, there are people, there are Kurds and others who believe, yeah, Kirkuk was always going to be retaken, right? Legally, Kirkuk is a disputed territory. There's an Article 140 of the Constitution that's meant to decide its fate. But in any case, that question's hard to answer. But I think I can say with some element of certainty that had the president taken Tillerson's deal, it would be much harder for Abadi to convince the US and others that now is the time to retake Kirkuk. And so it definitely catalyzed what we see now and really led to the withdrawal of Kurdish autonomy to now we're talking about 2003. And now we're talking about a remarriage, right? Renegotiating that contract and a lot of losses. I remember the next point would be on the sense of confidence, right? So despite all of this context, the Kurds decided to go with it, and there was this element of confidence. I remember in 2014, the US President Barack Obama, who had campaigned to not go to Iraq, who viewed Iraq as his predecessor's problem, doesn't want to get involved, always said we need Congress, we need the UN. Overnight, decided to re-intervene in Iraq, right, with airstrikes. No Congress, no UN. Why? Because Daesh had taken, and this is a few months after Mosul was taken, by the way. This is in August, not in June. Because Daesh was now threatening on the borders of Erbil and Baghdad. So the Kurds kind of understood from that the US supports the Kurdistan region. So I spoke to the president's chief of staff at the time, Fuad Hussein, President Barzani's chief of staff, and he told me, we knew from that day that we're no longer in a sort of 1975 era. 1975 being the last sort of historic time when Henry Kissinger famously decided to give up on the Kurds after supporting them for a few years and support the Iraqi government. So the Kurds thought, well, this is different. The US will support us now. I think that sort of sentiment perhaps fueled into the sense of confidence that led to thinking that nothing would happen. And if you spoke to the referendum committee, as we did, they said, we'll do the referendum, and okay, they might be upset, but what are they going to do? They'll just have to accept it, and then we can negotiate anyway, right? They were not foreseeing that America could, to their eyes, turn their back on the Kurds to support the Iraqi government. So looking ahead, what needs to happen now? So the biggest challenge for the Kurds at the moment is this question of unity, right? They've always been stronger negotiating when united. Since 1998, the KDP and the PUK, the two major parties, have had some agreement. And no matter what their internal problems have been, they have presented one face to Baghdad and to the international community. Even when an opposition movement emerged in 2009, I remember speaking to Noshwan Mustafa, who also passed away this year, and him telling me at that period, we're only concerned with domestic issues. We leave the foreign affairs for the president and for the ruling parties. The point being, there was this understanding that Kurdish autonomy in Iraq is contingent on unity and not being exploited by different powers to fight against each other, right? The legacies of the 20th century were at different points, different Kurdish leaders were with Saddam, against Saddam, with Iran, against Iran, just being played one off of the other. That to me is the key moving forward. And unfortunately, I think the Kirkuk episode shows just how divided the Kurdistan region's leadership is, right? Also a consequence of not institutionalizing a security force. For years, the Americans and others were telling the Kurdistan region, listen, we understand that you have issues with trust, but you need to institutionalize your forces. You can't have Peshmerga that are loyal to individuals and political parties. That's not how you build the state. And they kind of tried to do it, but weren't successful. So what happened in Kirkuk, against a few leaders from the Talabani family, particularly Pavel Talabani, the son, and Lahore Talabani, who are in charge of different Peshmerga, decided they were against the referendum, decided this is a time to negotiate a contract, to negotiate with Abadi, negotiate with Abadi supporters, and withdraw, to humiliate Masoud Barzani. So again, this unity led to what is the collapse of whatever gains that the Kurds had at that time, and it's a sad story, but it's kind of realpolitik in that sense. So looking forward, the Kurds, we have to ask what has made the Kurds more successful. We've already said that participating in politics in Iraq and Baghdad have strengthened their hands. And so the next step has to be, in my opinion, participate in the elections coming up in 2018 in Iraq as one list, right, if they can, so that they can win some 40 or so seats and then play kingmaker again, so that they can try and use those seats to either select whoever will be prime minister, and in doing so, gain some concessions. Begin negotiating, linking all issues together. However, at the moment, they're not united. And at the moment, it seems like this kind of I'm speaking of fairy tales.
Speaking of treason and of...
Yeah. So at the moment, it's far, and it's unlikely at the moment that this would move. And until that moves, they'll continue to be exploited, playing one off of the other. But the second sort of recommendation that we would have beyond unity, is go back to building rather than declaring a state, right? You don't need to declare a state to have a state. And in a funny way, the Kurdistan region was the example of it. And for some reason, this referendum was a departure from that. So go back to building a state. Don't rely only on these yes men, people like Zalmay Khalilzad, Jay Garner, Peter Galbraith, these kind of people who just say yes to Masoud Barzani no matter what, and don't tell him the realities and get paid millions of dollars to try and lobby. That's not how you build a state anymore. You build a state by institutionalizing your movements, institutionalizing your security sector, reconvening a parliament, and moving towards, some kind of democratic system. It's not easy, and corruption is part of any new state. I don't think the Kurds are a specific example of corruption. Corruption is everywhere, but these are the ways to rebuild the state. And from there, as Faleh said, you can begin to build a nation, right? Because this is Juan Lintz who wrote about this. Nation building always comes after state building, right? The people have to believe in a system, have to be part of a system to then feel that they have a nation. The other way around doesn't work, and I think proving now that the Kurdish nation is much in question. I know I'm finishing. That was my last comment. Hang on. So those were my last comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Rina. That's really genuine analysis and meticulous one. I just want to add one point, that not only the KRG as a government was divided territorially, institutionally, and politically. The problem of the referendum itself, conceived as a unifying tool. Okay, we are doing a referendum, we will bring all Kurds behind one slogan, independence. That's a unifying approach. Although there are forces that may not accept this, but a majority, a comfortable majority, went behind it. And the next thing, the next step, look at Catalonia, they went and declared independence. Look at the KRG after the referendum, what they did, go to elections. Elections is about competition, it's about struggle, it's about jockeying for power. It's the exact antithesis of the referendum mechanism. And in a sense, they built with one hand what they, just undone with the other. You do with this what you undo with this. It's really, I don't know how those people think. They are masters of self-deception and masters of haste, unwise, anti-steps, self-contradictory steps. Well, I heard about this. I called one guy, one of the researchers with us, Abdul Hakim goes, I said, are you nuts? What elections? You shouldn't speak about the elections at all, even if you really want, and you don't need to do it. You do it a year later. You are just destroying everything. The timing was wrong, this was wrong, and now you are on top of that, you are just, and that's the basis, by the way. That's the basis why Soleimani went to negotiate its package with Baghdad, because there were some mediator efforts from the Americans and from the Iran, by the way, not both sides. And they withdrew from Kirkuk on that basis. The conception now is that the Kurds lost. Lost what? The constitution is there. The federal structures constitutionally are still there. Physically on the ground, they are still there. What the Kurds lost was, first, their control over some disputed territories, which they only controlled in 2014, after June 2014. They lost these. All the areas they controlled during that period to use as a bargaining chip, they lost it. The other thing that they lost were not the federal characteristics of the region. Actually, they lost the confederal characteristics of the region, meaning they have international airports. This is the jurisdiction of federal authority. Everywhere in the world, they enjoyed it, and they should have kept silent just to keep it. It was an asset. Now they have lost it. In the future, these airports will be local, just domestic flights, or if they return their international status, they have to divide them into local flights and international flights, and the international would be under the jurisdiction of Baghdad, or the federal authority. They also lost the control over the border crossings to Turkey, Fish Harbour and Ibrahim al-Khalil as well, and the crossing between Iran and Soleimani. They have lost that. And with it, they have lost control over the oil pipelines. They can't produce oil anymore. Lastly, they lost the independence of the Peshmerga as a military force. It's no more, it would be no more under the jurisdiction of Barzani or anybody else. It will be part of the armed forces. I mean, these are the three extra federal features, or I call them confederal features. Renat called them sovereignty features. Sovereignty is perpetual power, and it has two sides, native and foreign, internal, external. So they have lost that. But they haven't lost the territory and the federal status. Still there as a principle, constitution, and as a reality. To what extent, these gaps between Soleimani and Erbil would be removed, I don't know. It will take some time, I think. Okay, I'll thank you for listening and for your kind attention, and thanks those who took the trouble to attend this session. We open the floor for any question, remarks. Yes, Mike? Yeah, you can join us here if you like.
Very briefly, Fallout was asking, what is a nation? And of course, as you know, in recent years, there's been an enormous amount of scholarship, Benedict Anderson, Imagine Nations, and so forth and so on. However, I have always been most enamored by a very simple definition by the great French 19th century sociologist Ernst Renan, who said simply, a nation is a daily plebiscite. A nation is a daily plebiscite. And by that he meant, I think, two very key things. Number one, by plebiscite, the will to be a nation. A large group has to want to be a nation. It doesn't matter exactly what characteristics would constitute them wanting to be a nation, but it has to be the will to be a nation. Plebiscite. And daily means you have to renew this will to be a nation. You have to renew it. Nations come and go, not as quickly as human life comes and goes, but nations were not always there, and they're not always going to be there. They come and they go. So I think Renan's insight that a nation is a daily plebiscite tells us a tremendous amount about what is a nation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. I just want to mention there's another translation of this. What is a nation by Renan? It's 1882 in the Sorbonne. That was a lecture, but he developed it later on as a book. Actually, he said common interest is more important. He was looking at the American experience. The Germans look at their own experience. They produce this ethnic concept of nation, language and culture, which is embraced in the Arab world. And it has some truth to it, but it is really dangerous. Because the German model, if you like, was tied to the to non-democratic polity. In 1807, as Fichte's addresses to the German nation. And that's why we saw later on that the German model was tied even to Nazism, which is a totalitarian dictatorship, whereas the French was liberal, etc. What he said was common interests and forgetting the grievances of the past. Because nations, they have regions, they have many cities, they have many tribes, they have this and that, and they had feuds in the past. So you have common interest now, at present, for all, and then you have to forget the grievances of the past. And then he said, a nation is a perpetual referendum. He translated as a plebiscite, daily plebiscite. It's the same. Perpetual referendum, istifta da'im. It always needs to be produced and reproduced and time again, notably in our region. And we see the results of the postponement of this or delaying that perpetual referendum in Kurdistan in the first place, and in Iraq in the second at the present. Yes, please. Sorry, yes.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Sorry.
The panorama you give us about post-referendum is very interesting about the internal dynamics. So if I will draw parallelism with Palestinian issue, I would say since this division between Fatah and Hamas, I would say international community and society, I would say the supporter, they less and less enthusiasm to the Palestinian issue is not anymore on the table, and this shows that really the foreign position is very related to local dynamics. I mean, we often talk about geopolitics as if this is something, no matter what is local dynamic is it's a master plan, and actors are positioning vis-a-vis this cause. So it's so I would say I see. Correct me if I am wrong. I see almost the same thing. The local division within Kurdistan. That this impacts so much how the American, French, and so on position themselves vis-a-vis the referendum and other issues. Would you like to collect?
Yeah, collect. Yeah, we'll collect.
في الحقيقة في بحثك في السليمانية أشرت إلى قضية أساسية، وهي أن مقومات الدولة الكردستانية لحد الآن لم تشيد، وإنما شيدت مجموعة مؤسسات سياحية وبعض الخدمات الأخرى. الحقيقة أكو قضية أساسية بالنسبة للبلاد العربية وللكرد، يعني هناك قومية ولكن ليست هناك ملامح أمة متماسكة. هناك شعوب عربية ولكن أمة عربية متماسكة لحد الآن ما موجودة، ولذلك تجربة الوحدة المصرية السورية فشلت. وفيصل الأول في الاحتفاء في إعلان استقلال الدولة العراقية عام 1932 في تشرين الأول أشار إلى أن العراق لحد الآن لم يكن شعبا واحدا، وإنما هو مجموعة شعوب أو مجموعة عشائر وطوائف. الكرد الحقيقة لدكتور فؤاد معصوم ملاحظة مبكرة بشأن قضية الكرد، هي أن الكرد العراقيين لحد الآن ما زالوا أقرب إلى بقية العراقيين من الكرد في تركيا أو الكرد في إيران بسبب مجموعة عوامل، ومنها قضية أساسية أشار لها الدكتور فالح في السليمانية، هي قضية المصالح. ما زالت مصالح الكرد عموما أقرب إلى بقية العراقيين، ومن يذهب إلى السليمانية ويجري استقصاء محايد وحتى في السليمانية يلاحظ أن الكثير من أصحاب المصالح يتعاطفون مع العرب ويتعاطفون مع السلطات العراقية، وحتى أحيانا يترحمون على صدام حسين لوجود بعض القضايا التي حمت لهم مصالح وأقامت لهم فرص للارتقاء والتقدم. عليه الكرد في العراق مع الأسف منذ عودة مصطفى برزاني في عام 59 إلى العراق هو لم يعمل ولم يؤمن بالدولة العراقية. وفي عام 1961 ونحن القوى المدنية الديمقراطية في العراق كان لنا وجهة نظر أن المطلوب من الحركة الكردية في العراق أن لا تحمل السلاح ضد عبد الكريم قاسم. كانت وجهة نظرنا أنه نحن ممكن أن نعبئ الجماهير ونتحرك من أجل بناء دولة ديمقراطية، ولكن مع الأسف مسعود مصطفى برزاني بفعل تأثيرات القوى المجاورة التي لم تؤمن أساسا بقيام الدولة العراقية، وعني خصوصا إيران، عبأت الأمور ضد عبد الكريم قاسم، وكانت القوى الكبرى أدت إلى إلحاق ضرر. المهم الاستفتاء جاء أيضا إلحاق ضرر كبير بالتجربة الديمقراطية في العراق. أنا أعتقد الكرد أجهضوا طموحهم وأجهضوا الكثير من مطالب بناء الدولة الديمقراطية في العراق. شكرا جزيلا.
I will maybe go back to history, and because I was reading the periodical of Kurdistan in the Ottoman Empire, it was interesting that what I realized that the Kurdish nationalism was somehow a reaction of nationalism of other non-dominant groups within the same geographical area. I mean, the Armenian or the Assyrian nationalism. And within these articles, the Prince Bedr Khan was actually calling the Kurdish intellectuals and the tribal leaders to perform or engage a dialogue with these non-minority groups against the centralized states that was manipulating, for example, the Kurdish tribal leaders. And we can draw a parallel with what is going on in KRG. For example, some non-dominant groups such as the Turkmens and the Yazidis and even the Christians were not very happy with the referendum. So I think the main failure here was that the Kurds still couldn't find a space for dialogue with other non-dominant groups in the region. I mean, except in Syria. In Syria, they are somehow trying to find dialogue with the Syriacs and so on, but in Iraq still it's
Can
not
you
clear.
specify the non-dominant groups? Like,
In Iraq,
no, you talk
in
generally.
Ottoman Empire, I mean, within the same geographic area were the Armenians and the Assyrians.
Have you seen the Siva, the map of the Siva treaty? Armenia was far-flung up north, Turkey, and then Kurdistan, then
Yeah,
the
but
Arab Iraq.
for example,
I mean,
in places
there's no
like
connection.
Van and so on, there were mixed population.
I see, okay.
And this is what Bedr Khan was actually trying to address this issue.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm a Kurd, and I'm proud to be a Kurd.
We have a Kurd.
Okay. I thank you very much for this very valuable speech, and I want to appreciate the Kurdish people's struggle for 100 years, suffering and fighting and paying a lot of pain for reaching a self-determination and for their freedom. So it's only people who has a very huge number and who has no land of their own. So this is a tragedy, although these people are fighting not just for themselves, but also for the others. They're fighting ISIS now, and we can see how brave the Kurdish women fought against ISIS in Syria and in Rojava, in the land of the Kurds in Rojava, North Syria. So this is a really respectful step by the Kurdish people. What happened in Iraqi Kurdistan was really tragedy, and we felt so sad as a Kurd of Lebanon. What happened over there, although they had a lot of advantages and they could do a lot of things over there, but the tribe and the family benefit, I think, was a real obstacle in front of the people in government in Kurdistan of Iraq. So we saw what happened when Rojava and the Kurds in Syria fought against ISIS. The political Kurds in Iraq, they closed the border and they had embargo over the Kurds in Rojava, and this wasn't a positive side of them. And their relationship with Turkey, the Turkey who put Salah ad-Din Demirtas in jail and put Abdullah Öcalan in jail, and putting thousands of political and people who are fighting and trying to have self-determination for the Kurds, put them in jail.
You will listen,
So,
you will see a lot of details. We have a session about Kurds in Syria.
so the relation between
we have
Barzani and Iraq and Turkey is something so bad, I think, and it's so negative.
You're right, you're completely right. But what I'm saying is, your remarks about the Kurds in Syria, we have Harriet, Dr. Harriet also.
Okay.
She wrote, just finished a book on
Okay,
Syria.
thank you very much.
It's a fantastic book. And then we have next to her sitting is Genghis Khan.
Okay. So,
It's also completed a book on Kurds in Turkey.
Okay.
And we have sessions about this. So part of your contribution, you can respond to what they say. You may add something, you may have questions, and thank you very much for your thoughts.
thank you very much.
you.
Thank you.
Okay, I think it's time to have a break for 30 minutes or so. The next session is about Syria, and we are very proud of the woman in Kobani. We had our researchers there, by the way. Still, some of them are there. And you'll see the book, you'll love it when you read it.
Yep. Hello. We're going to move on to our second panel. Now we'll focus on the developments in Syria. We will firstly begin with Harriet Alsop, who has authored the volume on Syria of this overall project, and she will present her findings and discuss the developments in Syria. And then we will have a talk by Michael Gunter, who will look at more the regional dimensions of Rojava and the role of Russia and the US. Okay, Harriet, please.
Thank you. So before the Arab Spring reached Syria in 2011, the expression of Kurdish identity and culture and political organization around the Kurdish identity was criminalized. The Syrian government used Arab nationalism as to legitimize its rule, and
Is it possible you can speak?
Raise your voice.
Or, sorry, if that's better like that.
okay.
Yeah, sorry.
And citizenship of Syria was defined as Syrian Arab, and its territory was defined as part of the Arab homeland, and this was all in the constitution and other laws in Syria. So the Kurds therefore had to either assimilate their identity, to deny their ethnic identity in favor of another, or to hide it, or to be considered a threat to the state and its unity. However, Kurds have continuously organized around protecting that identity in Syria and promoting democracy, and since the 1950s, the political party has been the main institution of this, and they've produced a distinct Syrian Kurdish identity. Now, in March 2011, Kurds joined the protest movement in Syria and the national protest movement. But as it militarized and sectarianism increased, Kurdish political organizations adopted a position that was distinct from both the government and from the developing Arab and Islamic opposition groups. Then in 2012, government forces withdrew from northern Syria, and one Kurdish political party, the Democratic Union Party, or the PYD, stepped into the governance void. The PYD took over government institutions and control of local resources. Policies and laws that had marginalized the Kurds for decades before, and which had criminalized expression of the Kurdish identity, could not then extend but beyond the reach of the state. And they lost the negative impact on Kurdish identity. And for the first time in Syrian Kurdish history, they experienced a sort of self-rule and representation. And that self-rule came in the form of democratic autonomy, which is a model of bottom-up direct democracy, which is built around local communes. And it's a model based on the philosophy and theory of of Abdullah Öcalan, the leader of the PKK. Democratic autonomy has steadily expanded through the fight against ISIS, and in 2016 they declared a federal system for northern Syria. So the PYD administration has secured territory and resources and protected the Kurdish majority areas from the worst of the conflict in Syria. And it's maintained services and offered successful local strategies for coping with security issues and the economic crisis there. And it's proved effective security. And through its forces, the Kurds have increased their agency and come to the forefront of local, regional, and international relations. The PYD's institutionalization of ethnic and religious rights and equalities has also allowed people to think differently about their identity. And of the people we surveyed in Syria, 92% of them identified themselves as Kurdish, and 52% said that this has changed since the start of the uprising. And this was associated with, partly to do with new threats to their identity from ISIS or from the government, but also to do with an awakening or a new mobilization and the new freedoms to express Kurdishness. And throughout this, an overwhelming consensus has developed among Syrian Kurds that federalism is a system that can secure Kurdish rights and representation, and that local decision-making is an important part of this. So these tangible gains was recognized as positive by the population, and rights and security clearly boosted the support for the administration amongst Kurds. But looking at the situation, looking at Syrian Kurds through the lens of identity and representation for this project allowed us to assess its popular legitimacy and identified also the main problems for representation of Syrian Kurds. And what we found was that there's quite a split in opinion about the administration, about whether people thought it was democratic and representative, and those who didn't. And the reasons for this relate particularly to the fact that one political party and ideology has dominated over governance and social organization. And this has produced political and social tensions. Looking at northern Syria today and the autonomy that it's developed, it might be easy to forget that there's actually a host of other political parties which trace their origins to 1957 and to the foundation of the first Syrian Kurdish political party, and which are not connected to the PYD. So on the eve of the 2011 protest movements in Syria, there were estimated to be 15 or 20 of these political parties, which now are represented mostly by the Kurdish National Council organization. But despite this historical presence in Syria, it was actually the PYD, which was formed in 2003 in Syria, which is a relative newcomer to Syrian Kurdish politics. It's a PYD that's guided all the institutions and structures of government in the region. So whilst there is a multitude of organizations and parties that operate in Syria now within the system, the other political parties within the KNC, the Kurdish National Council, do not have any legal status in Syria, and their activities are restricted. So the political pluralism that the system contains internally is therefore limited to those parties which have accepted this system and form of governance, model of governance. So at the center of this political divide, which also manifests regionally between the PKK and the KDP, is ideology and distinct understandings of Kurdish society and identity. So according to Öcalan's theories, the realization of the democratic autonomy project in Syria should involve a social revolution to produce a moral society which is stripped of social hierarchies and capable of autonomous governance. So in comparison to this, the parties connected to the 1957 genealogy of parties, which organize around distinct Kurdish national rights, really, and more broad definitions of democracy. And these are rooted particularly within pre-existing social structures. So the nature of Kurdish society and Kurdish politics regionally therefore limits the PYD administration's ability to represent Kurdish society and highlights further problems for extending its legitimacy beyond the gains that I've already mentioned. So Kurdish society is at the same time both fragmented and cohesive and united. It's fragmented in Syria demographically between three regions, Afrin in the northeast and Kobani and, the northwest, Afrin, Kobani and Jazeera. And it's also fragmented by sub-state identities and channels of representation which have been preserved in Syria and developed to prevent state intervention into local Kurdish affairs. So these include tribal or family relations, local communities, as well as political parties. However, it's also united by the Kurdish identity itself and the idea of common interests of the Kurds, both in Syria and regionally. And it's also united by a sense of shared national history and that the Kurds have a common cause. But these local and pan-state identities are not mutually exclusive, but are intertwined with each other. And the concept of democratic autonomy, which is at the center of PYD governance, involves the social revolution, and through it, what Öcalan called a moral society will be developed. Individuals will be liberated from the social hierarchies and reorganized around the communes. And this should form the basis of the government structures that guide it. So as well as being connected to a political party itself, many Kurds believe that this social project threatens pre-existing organizational and identity structures, such as the tribe or the family, also other political parties. And it was these sub-state and traditional social relations and political parties that formed the basis of local self-representation before 2011 and formed a buffer between the society and state, and which had been woven into sort of Syrian Kurdish identity and nationalism through political organization around Kurdish identity. So the PYD in this respect has an advantage over other Kurdish parties, or those of the KNC, because they're not limited by the territorial restrictions of local social organization. And this has historically weakened other Kurdish political parties and prevented their extension into sort of mass parties. But the PYD attempt to break down these traditional social orders in the midst of the crisis in Syria has also caused tensions which have provoked criticism from within Kurdish society and from other political parties. So reorganization around the commune has not been entirely successful. Participation, which is fundamental to the success of the democratic autonomy project, we saw in our research that it was not as high as we originally expected. And although it does vary considerably across the Kurdish regions, in Afrin, for example, control is quite complete, and there isn't an alternative to communal organization, and people express the belief that they should participate, and that if they didn't, then they would maybe experience problems. In Kobani also, the destruction of the town has left the PYD as the dominant power there, but it's lacking physical infrastructure, and much of the population has left, although some has returned. In the Jazeera, the PYD control is weakest, and participation appears to be lower and opposition more prevalent. So certainly ample space was open for involvement in the commune system, and many participants believed it gave them a voice and a role in decision-making, especially in local issues. But then a large number chose not to attend these meetings. Criticisms about the communes included claims that they were dominated by PYD supporters, that other people's opinions were not listened to, and that decisions had already been made, and that there was the development of a new hierarchy of loyalty to the party and the ideology. So whilst local support and legitimacy had been gained, particularly through the provision of rights and services and equalities, and from decentralization itself, there was still significant resistance to the transformations, and particularly to the social transformations that the PYD envisages, and to the state-like powers that it's assumed. And although there was ample opportunity for participation in the direct democracy structures, and barring Afrin, there was freedom of choice about involvement, there was little real space to canvass for political alternatives. So outside the region, the PYD has not gained any real political support internationally. It's gained military support for the fight against ISIS. And this has increased its agency considerably, and it's also increased its local legitimacy. And security was a primary reason why people were satisfied with the administration. But providing security against external threat can't be relied on as a long-term source of legitimacy. And already there's evidence to suggest that it's less reliable than it was. And the expansion of the PYD project beyond Kurdish areas has produced criticisms from within Kurdish society, because it's been seen to move away from the legitimacy claims defined by the Kurdish identity and the Kurdish territories associated with it. So in attempts to consolidate expansion into non-Kurdish areas, there's formed alliances which have also attracted international military assistance, such as the Syrian Democratic Forces, formed in 2015. And this expansion of territory and political and military alliances that are the basis of the federal entity that's been established in northern Syria. However, with these extensions into non-Kurdish areas, there's also been changes in policy and rhetoric, particularly of the organizations within the administration, which has steadily sort of de-ethnicized, so taken out references to Kurdish identity and ethnicity, and they've reorientated around identity defined by the democratic nation and by the moral society. Because Kurdish identity is strong in Syria and the PYD is considered by most people to be a Kurdish political party, this has also led to, the policy shift has led to criticisms of it. So if and when ISIS is removed from Syria and the Syrian government continues to increase its control and the US rolls back its assistance to to YPG, the governance void that allowed the PYD state building and expansion is likely to contract. It's also unclear if local alliances with non-Kurdish groups, the basis of the federal entity, will endure post-ISIS, and whether they can translate into common position also towards the Syrian government. It's almost inevitable that these alliances will be challenged in some way and become a point of tension as different interests develop, as the situation changes. So to conclude, whilst the PYD administration has successfully institutionalized its autonomy and governance structures, this has been achieved within the governance void caused by the retreat of central government from northern Syria. There was not, however, a corresponding void in sub-state and pan-state organization and in identity construction. And the PYD's state-like powers and project have produced what appeared to be irreconcilable tensions within Kurdish society and with other political groups there. Social and political opposition to the domination of the PYD and its ideology is identifiable in Syria, but it was neither effectively organized or it was hindered by its position outside the PYD system itself. It's also hindered by the wider Syrian conflict and insecurity and fears of losing positive gains in Kurdish rights and freedoms and decentralization that have been made so far, and which all Kurdish political parties and people want to retain. For the Kurdish administration itself in the long term, the rights and securities are likely to prove insecure as a basis for legitimacy if it can't deliver more widely accepted forms of representation and democracy. And these forms would also have to accommodate the pre-existing identities and representative structures that exist, as well as alternative political views. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, a lot concerning what will happen to the Kurdish autonomy in Syria, a lot depends on the regional as well as international forces, and we have Michael Gunter who will talk about these and the impact of alliances the Kurds have and whether they will be, in the long run, still there when the need comes. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me? If you cannot hear me, raise a hand and I will endeavor to enunciate more clearly. I want to start out by thanking Professor Fala Jabir for inviting me here. A wonderful campus. I'm very pleased to be here. Unfortunately, I'm also going to start out by having to recognize the former president of AUB, Malcolm Kerr, who was so tragically and cowardly murdered here during your civil war back in the early 1980s. Malcolm Kerr was the president of AUB. He was a great scholar on Middle Eastern politics. I never personally knew him, but I came to know his wife, Anne, played tennis with her in several locations around the Middle East. She was a good tennis player, and they produced a son, Steve Kerr, who became a great basketball player in the United States, played on the Chicago Bulls with the great Michael Jordan. And I must say that Steve Kerr, the son, was one of the greatest three-point shooters in the history of the NBA, precisely because he came from Beirut, where nobody could dribble the ball because you were blowing everything up in those days and there was no even surface. So all he could do was learn to shoot the ball, and that gave him a great career in the NBA. And if you follow NBA basketball now, you know that Steve Kerr, the son of your late president here, Steve Kerr is the manager, the coach of the NBA champion Golden State Warriors. grandfather Kerr, Stanley Kerr, was a great scholar in the 1920s and 30s, wrote The Lions of Marash. Okay, moving on. Well, I'll tell you, Steve Kerr shows up at the MESA meetings in the United States, Middle East Studies Association, and frankly, since he's a multi-millionaire as a basketball player, I would suggest that you people at AUB look into the possibilities of donations and support. Okay, my talk is history repeating itself or deja vu all over again? Question mark. The Sykes-Picot Agreement and other World War I agreements and settlements like San Remo and the Lausanne Treaty denied the Kurds a state, largely because the Kurds' sense of nationalism was much less developed than Arabs, Turks, and Iranians. Rather, the Kurds identified as Fala's study shows with other identities, such as tribe on the lower level and Islam on the higher level. Also, to put it blankly, you've heard of the Melian dialogue from the Peloponnesian Wars that Thucydides, the great Greek historian, wrote about. The Melian dialogue is that the powerful take what they can and the weak grant what they must. And the Kurds were weak, and they did what they had to do, submit to the powerful Arabs, Turks, and Iranians. Now, as events moved on, treaties actually occurred that kept the Kurds down. I must tell you, the Sadabad Treaty in 1938 between Turkey, Iraq, and Iran had as one of its side goals to keep the Kurds down and out of making any attempts at some type of recognition on the regional level. The Baghdad Pact in 1958 was also in part, unbeknownst to many, with the determination to keep the Kurds down. So how have the Kurds risen? Ironically, Kurdish nationalism largely rose as a reaction to Arab, Turkish, and Iranian nationalism trying to assimilate the Kurds. I think that's an important point, that Kurdish nationalism today is largely a reaction to the attempt on the part of Turkish, Iraqi, Arab, and Iranian nationalism to assimilate the Kurds. But given the Kurds' division into these four separate states, Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria, Kurdish nationalism has developed differently in each state. So in a sense, as Fala mentioned earlier today, you have four separate Kurdish nationalisms, more so than just one pan-Kurdish nationalism. And indeed, even in among these Kurdish nationalisms, you have violent rivalries. For example, the PKK notoriously was born fighting against other Kurdish, Turkish groups. The PKK has notoriously fought against the KDP and PUK in Iraq. In more recent times, the KRG in Iraq has been a very noticeable rival of the PYD and Rojava in Syria. Or even, of course, in Iraq, the KDP and PUK were violent rivals. They fought a civil war in the mid-1990s. In Iran, the KDPI has been a rival of Kamala and also the Pijak. And in Syria, as Harriet pointed out just a few minutes ago, PYD, which is the predominant Kurdish party in Syria today, has had violent rivalries with other lesser Kurdish parties in Syria. Now, for various reasons, Kurdish nationalism today is weakest in Iran. Although, ironically, with the exception of the KRG, the only entity in modern times that resembled a Kurdish state was, of course, the famous Mahabad Republic right after World War II in Iran. Mullah Mustafa Barzani, the great Iraqi Kurdish leader, probably to a large extent never really exceeded the bounds of Kurdish tribalism to achieve some type of Kurdish nationalism, although in retrospect, many Kurds look upon Mullah Mustafa as a great Kurdish nationalist. And he was, but to a limited extent, maybe. He had great relative success in Iraq, maybe climaxed by the 1970 agreement with the Baghdad government, which all went to hell in 1975 when Baghdad destroyed Barzani's movement. And Kissinger, the American Secretary of State under President Nixon, notoriously said something about why the United States was no longer supporting the Iraqi Kurds. Kissinger said, "Do not confuse missionary activity with realpolitik." And that, of course, has been the bane of Kurdish nationalism in modern times. Anyway, moving on. And I must say, I'm just being very brief here. I'm speaking in general terms. There are all kinds of nuances of meaning here that we could get bogged down in. So certainly if you don't agree with these things I'm saying in Q&A, bring them up and we can get into the nuances. Anyway, moving on. After the disaster in 1975, Kurdish nationalism in Iraq only began to rise again in the 1980s, largely because of the Iran-Iraq War, which for the first time, the Iran-Iraq War, which resulted, I think, in something like 1 million casualties, the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, for the first time began to internationalize and at least regionalize the Kurdish issue, which earlier had been kept practically invisible. And then, of course, even more, the U.S. wars against Saddam Hussein in 1991 and 2003 led to the KRG, Kurdistan Regional Government in Iraq, by 1992. So that, as the 20th century came to an end, the old aphorism saying that Kurds have no friends but the mountains began to change because, in effect, precariously maybe, the United States, for a variety of reasons, began to be the protector of the Iraqi Kurds, the KRG. And the United States support became even stronger when Baghdad partially collapsed in 2014 before the onslaught of ISIS. And the United States was looking for local boots on the ground to stop ISIS and identified the KRG in Iraq and the PYD and its militia YPG and Women's Auxiliary YPJ in Syria as the workable boots on the ground against ISIS. And that certainly led to a closer bond between the United States and the Kurds, not only in Iraq, but in Syria. However, I must say that a lot of us, including myself, were misled by what the Kurds seemingly were creating in northern Iraq. Unfortunately, the old problem, Kurdish divisions continued in northern Iraq between the KDP and PUK, and this KRG crisis that we have just, that began after the referendum and we're going through right now, in part is due to continuing Kurdish divisions, which remain there and just beg their regional opponents, in this case Baghdad, to use the old divide and rule tactics against the Kurds. So the KRG turned out very quickly nowhere as strong as many people like myself thought, with this quick collapse or partial collapse in Kirkuk. But and my overall main theme here is that I do not think it's deja vu all over again, that we're right back to the beginning. The Kurds have lost a great deal in northern Iraq, but it is not the total disaster of 1975 for reasons I will get to. Well, I'm here already. Why? Why not a total disaster? Because first of all, I do not think that the United States will allow Baghdad to totally destroy the KRG because of the way the Kurds have worked with the U.S. against ISIS and against Saddam in the past. In addition to at least some, maybe a large extent, the United States, and I think largely accurately, sees Iran as one of the winners of all this KRG collapse in the last month. And the United States has no intention of allowing I am going, and I'm going to continue going until Falah stops me, okay? Okay, the United States is not going to allow Iran to reduce Iraq and the KRG into a Persian satrapy. Also, I do not think Abadi is another Saddam Hussein. Abadi does not have the animus against the Kurds that Saddam did. We will see. Now, I'm going to make a few comments on Turkey. Turkey, where three great Kurdish revolts occurred in the 1920s and 1930s. But after the third revolt in 1938, the Kurdish movement in Turkey seemed to collapse and, frankly, shocked the Turkish government when, in the 1960s and 70s, the beginnings of a new modern Kurdish movement opposed to the way the Kurds were marginalized in Turkey arose. And formally, the PKK revolt began in 1984, and in time, for better or for worse, not all Kurds support the PKK in Turkey, but most Kurds, even who do not support the PKK, will say that the PKK and its leader, Abdullah Öcalan, reawoke the Kurdish cause in Turkey. And since that time, the Kurdish cause in Turkey has had many ups and downs. One of the great downs was the capture of Öcalan by Turkish authorities with considerable U.S. aid in Nairobi, Kenya in February 1999. But this did not crush the PKK. Why the PKK continued? A variety of reasons. I think mainly the PKK had done so much to let the Kurdish genie out of the bottle that it was no longer possible to put the Kurds back into captivity in Turkey. In addition, I see as very important the Turkish application to join the EU, which was formally begun accession talks in 2005. And if Turkey is going to join the EU, it must be a more democratic country, and this, of course, is a backdoor way of partially solving the Kurdish problem in Turkey by having Turkey at least go through the negotiation process with the EU. Now, in addition to the PKK in Turkey, do you want me to stop? I mean, I was asked to talk. I was asked to talk for 30 minutes, and I have prepared things, but I will stop at any time. But I intend to continue. I became notorious for this. I was in Iraq in May, and they were pulling me off the stage, but I refused to leave the stage because they invited me to talk, okay? So here I am. So,
The topic is on Syria, so...
well, I was told the topic is about the overall situation with the Kurds. So please let me continue, and I will get to Syria. Okay. There are legal, the PKK is illegal in Turkey. There are legal Kurdish pro-Kurdish parties in Turkey, including today the HDP, which is very important. I must tell you that early on, Erdogan, the president of Turkey, probably did more for the Kurdish cause than anybody else in Turkish history, with the possible exception of the late President Turgut Özal, who tragically died suddenly in April 1993, leading to all kinds of conspiracy theories that Özal was murdered by this person or that person, which I do not subscribe to. Özal was a very unhealthy person. Anyway, Erdogan in 2005 said the Turkish government has made many mistakes. It needs more democracy to solve the Kurdish problem. That was the good Erdogan. And the good Erdogan continued with the Oslo talks between the PKK and Turkey starting in late 2008, the Kurdish opening with the PKK and the Kurds starting in about 2010, and finally leading up to an incredible ceasefire between the Turkish state and the PKK in March 2013, which tragically broke down in July 2015. Why did the ceasefire break down? One main reason is that this pro-Kurdish legal party, the HDP, became the first pro-Kurdish party to enter the Turkish parliament by passing the threshold of 10% of the vote. And that denied Erdogan's AKP party, helped deny the AKP party of Erdogan the majority. And that infuriated Erdogan, who decided to appeal to Turkish nationalism and break off the ceasefire and begin the struggle again. On the other hand, I must tell you that Selahattin Demirtas, the Kurdish leader of the HDP, I think made a strategic error when he said to Erdogan, Demirtas said, "We will not allow you to be president. We will not allow you to be president." Well, what do you expect Erdogan to say? Okay, I give up. Of course not. And Demirtas has been in jail now for over a year. So, in some ways now, because of the breakdown of the ceasefire, the Kurds are back to square one in Turkey again, as they almost seem to be in Iraq, but not really, as I have been also arguing. Now, I have come to Syria. Shall I continue, Falal, or shall I shut up? It's up to you, sir. Okay. The title of one of my books dealing with the Syrian Kurds is Out of Nowhere. out of nowhere. And by that I mean that we heard very little of the Kurds in Syria until suddenly the Syrian civil war that began in March 2011, among other effects, led to Assad having to pull back his authority in order to survive. And suddenly in the summer of 2012, the Syrian Kurds in effect became autonomous. This grew considerably in the struggle over ISIS. The United States failed again and again to identify some party on the ground in Syria that could successfully battle against ISIS, and finally settled on the PYD-YPG as the force to back against ISIS. In other words, the United States is supporting the Syrian Kurds, and it gets even more ironic because the PYD is in many ways an affiliate of the PKK. So although the United States has the PKK listed as a terrorist organization, the United States is supporting the PKK's PYD affiliate in Syria, and also supported the PKK directly when it came to the partial rescue of the Yazidis in 2014 when they were attacked by the ISIS. This is all the more convoluted because Turkey is in many ways one of the most important U.S. NATO ally. And I can tell you a number of stories on that if I had more time. Turkey is the second largest army in NATO, a very important NATO member. But here the United States is going against its NATO Turkish ally to support, in effect, the enemy of Turkey, the PKK, which makes Turkey very angry, and I think rightfully so, and makes me also wonder just how long the U.S. support of the PYD will be. And as soon as the ISIS is taken care of territorially in Syria, I suspect the U.S. will pull its support for the PYD, and we will be back to square one in Syria too, as Russia and Iran support Assad reintegrating his lost territory. So in Syria too, we may soon see the Kurdish movement crushed. Iran, I told you, I don't see, Iran is where the Kurds are the weakest. Why are the Kurds so weak in Iran? Renard pointed out that the Iranian authorities are busy killing Kurdish leaders. I guess that's part of it. Also, frankly, I think Iran is a more clever country than Baghdad or Syria or Turkey. The Iranian tradition of statecraft and how to manipulate things is worthy of great study. And we've seen it in what has happened with Kirkuk in just the last month. Also, the Kurds, unlike in Turkey and Arab countries, the Kurds are closely related to the Iranians. Now, I have here a number of things I could talk about in conclusion, but I don't have time. I sense the desire for me to stop, so I'm going to accept that sense. But in answer to my initial question, is this history repeating itself all over again? Partially, but not really. I think the Kurdish genie has been let out of the bottle, and there are ups and downs, and there's a down going on right now, but the Kurds have achieved more than they ever had previously in modern times. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Michael. We have about 10 minutes to discuss your questions and comments. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand. Yes, two. We have a microphone, so wait for the microphone.
Hello. Thank you for your very interesting speeches or explanations. I have two questions actually. The first one, is the American foreign policy is changing right now? Like in the past, we know that Kissinger stated that the main foreign policy is to maintain the status quo in the region. Especially if we listen to the current pro or pan Arab statements or like the Ba'ath statements on the creation of the Kurdish, on the attempt to have a Kurdish state in Iraq, and they comment on the creation of the autonomous Kurdish Rojava. So they say that it's an American project to partition the Middle East and to create a Kurdish state. So is the foreign policy changing from maintaining status quo to creating a Kurdish state? And the other question, as we know, in 1962 there was when the nationality was revoked from 120,000 Syrian Kurds, so they became totally stateless. So I have a question. So before that date, they all had the nationality and all the rights associated with it. I have a question. Yeah, these are the two questions basically.
Okay, I'll answer the first question, and Harriet is more equipped to answer the second question about the Ajanib. And matter of fact, a lot of what I know about the Syrian Kurds, I learned from Harriet. She helped me a great deal, plus Eva Salzberg and Jordi Tidjol, who are great scholars on Syria. But you ask me, is the U.S. foreign policy changing? Well, we have Donald Trump right now, and he is a work in progress, and he certainly has different views on American foreign policy. But overall, no. The United States feels that it should encourage the borders in the Middle East to remain, and that means Iraq and Syria should remain as states, and there should be Kurdish rights within these states, but no Kurdish state, because this will lead to instability and war. That is the American foreign policy. I have gone to meetings in Washington. I have talked to these people, and I present a different point of view, and they think I'm naive and silly and ignorant, and that's just the beginning of what they call me. So, no, I don't think we're seeing a great change in U.S. foreign policy.
So your question was about before the census.
So they had the rights associated with the nationality, excuse me, when did they get the nationality? That was under the French mandate. They got this.
Yeah, most Kurds were given nationality during the French mandate. Lots of Kurds were unregistered anyway before 1962 when the census happened. So there was a fair amount of movement in the area between Iraq and Turkey and Syria. But lots of Kurds who actually had citizenship and were even those who had conducted military service and had positions within parliament even were stripped of citizenship at that time. And also they were asked to prove residency. And lots of people, even if they had family dating back hundreds of years, they couldn't prove that because, the organization was based on an agrarian society and people didn't keep receipts for sheep tax payments dating back hundreds of years. And so I don't think citizenship and nationality at that time had the same resonance or importance to people's lives before that moment. But also it's important to note that at that time it wasn't just the Kurds that didn't have citizenship as well. Many Arab tribes would move between Iraq and Syria. In fact, they settled even later, probably, than a lot of other Kurdish groups who were nomadic still. But Kurdish settlement was dated back hundreds of years, like more.
Thank you. Yes. Can you please come?
Hi. This question is directed at Professor Alsop. And you mentioned communal participation in the self-administration and to what degree the communal participation took place. I don't know how updated, but last month the self-administration led by the PYD recently held the first phase of elections on a communal level, which is the first in 3 phases. And I understand that some of the political parties, like the KNC, sat it out. And I was actually just wondering at the communal level, since they were communal elections, what the voter turnout was, or if you know anything about that. To what degree was there participation in these elections?
Thank you. John?
I don't have the figures. I was wondering if I did. I thought the turnout was lower than I would expect it to have been.
I think 1 million people voted or something
Yeah,
like that.
about just less, I think.
Yeah, so
In total, of the 3 Kurdish regions.
more? More? Yeah.
Yeah? I don't think the statistics that the administration, I don't think they were that high.
That's a lot of people in Myanmar. That shows the level of support for the project. It's not just one group or a few people. It's wider than that, the support. Yeah. Any other questions? Sorry, we couldn't be more of help. Yeah, go on.
So I guess my follow-up question was there an organized boycott of the political parties, or was it also individuals? I don't know if this is common knowledge, but were there also individuals that chose to sit it out, or was that only through organized boycotts?
It wasn't organized boycott, as far as I know. It was just some people were not interested. They thought they will be lending legitimacy to PYD, and especially Kurdish people who support the other Kurdish parties were not, they discouraged their supporters, but it wasn't a formal boycott.
Okay, so it wasn't formal.
Yeah, but also it was all territory of Northern Federation, so there's a lot of Arabs, Cherkess, Chechen, Syrian. So some of these communities do support the Democratic Autonomy Project, but others don't. And so I think more elections will be held in future. So, and we will know more in future, I guess. Yeah, thank you. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for such an opportunity. So first of all, I would like to apologize for my very ignorant question, because I have no political background. I came from, let's say, a charity background, and I work in Kurdistan area in supporting of the Yazidis in the IDP camps. So I'm so sorry about my question. So what triggered me in the first session and this session is that when they described 1975 as a crisis. So I lived at that time, and I have a very blurred memory about that time. So first of all, I would like to ask, when we say crisis, what do we mean by crisis? And who was the victims of the crisis? And was it a humanitarian crisis or political crisis? And who was behind that crisis? To me and to my memory, I see a lot of similarities between Halabja and 1975. So I would be so grateful for any kind of clarification about this. Thank you.
Thank you. And Hanan, we'll take more and then we'll have an answer. So we'll answer your question in a while. Thank you. Yes, Hanan.
Okay, thank you very much. With all respect, I think there were some issues that you had to concentrate on more, especially for the Kurds in Syria. When the Arabic Spring started in the Arab world, especially in Syria, the Kurds in Syria, they took the third path. This third path was not with the regime and nor with the opposition. They took a path which supported or which was held on the ideology of Öcalan, which says the democratic state instead of national state. There is a big difference between the two ideology. This is what's happening in Kurdistan of Iraq, and this is what's happening in Kurdistan or in Rojava. This is the difference. This ideology says that all nations, all people, all religion can live together inside one land without any separation, without any state of the Kurds as a nation. So this is the difference between the Kurds in Rojava who support the ideology of Öcalan, who mostly support PYD, mostly support this ideology, and support the military forces YPG and YPG who fight very bravely against ISIS. And most of people, they support this kind of thinking. And this is the difference between what happened in Iraq and what happened in Syria. And recently we saw the Battle of Raqqa, how the people of Raqqa were freed from ISIS. And I don't think that the Kurds, as the professor said, are the Kurds of the past. The Kurds have gained a lot of experience through their experience, historical experience, and I think they won't be down again. Although that they need to be united, it's very important, but the Kurds have changed. They changed their personality. They held their weapon for their own for the first time, not for the others.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Shall we answer and then move on? Yeah, 2-3 minutes. So, who wants to have a go first? Yeah, about crisis. What is a crisis and how do we define a crisis?
I went to China a few times, and in China they define a crisis as a great immediate problem that challenges your future immediately, but also presents an opportunity. So the Chinese character for crisis has both horrible problem but also opportunity. And that is, I think, an insight into what a crisis is. It's an immediate, challenging problem that has to be solved now, but presents opportunities. And certainly 1975 was a crisis for the Kurdish movement in Iraq and for Kurds all over who identified with what was going on in Iraq. Now, I don't know what else I can say. We heard some eloquent Kurdish nationalists talk, and maybe Harriet can add something to this.
Well, any response about any of the questions?
Well, I think you're right that the Kurdish situation has changed, and it won't be the same as it was. We can have to move forward from here. I think the important thing, it's important to remember that in northern Syria that there are other political voices, and there are still people, Kurds, who are nationalist and feel that it's necessary to recognize Kurdish, specifically national rights. And that has created some tensions in society. And I agree that there has been a lot of support, and particularly for the YPG, and I think support for the YPG and what we found in our research is higher than for the PYD itself. And that, I think, is also partly because it's also retained this more reference to Kurdish identity and is seen as sort of, well, in a sense, sort of more fulfilling some of those aims which are associated both with the sort of Kurdish identity and national interests as well.
If I may, very briefly, the Kurds are usually ruled by their neighbors through divide and rule tactics. And that has just been witnessed again in Kirkuk. However, I think the Kurds now can, in a sense, partially reverse that. The alliance against the Kurds right now against the KRG, Turkey, Baghdad, and Iran, this is an unnatural alliance, and I don't think it's going to last very long. Turkey is Sunni, Iran is Shia. Turkey, when it figures out what Iran has been doing, is certainly going to oppose Iran's attempts to dominate the Kurds in Iraq. How much Iraq wants to be dominated by Iran, I think remains to be seen, but certainly the Sunnis in Iraq and the Kurds in Iraq do not want to be dominated by Shia Iran. And Muqtada al-Sadr, the powerful militia Shiite leader in Iraq, has broken to some extent with Iran and has been talking to Saudi Arabia. Israel is not going to allow Iran to settle on the Israeli border in southern Syria now that the wars in Syria are coming to an end. So what I am saying is that this temporary alliance against the Kurds of the regional powers that kept the Kurds down for almost a century, I don't think can be revitalized and maintained, and will quickly collapse. And astute Kurdish diplomacy will take advantage of this and move forward.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the questions and comments, and also thank you very much to our panelists. We will break now, and we reconvene in half to 2:30. So see you in see you in 2 hours. Thank you.
We're about ready to begin. With your permission, we have two talks, and the first talk will be by my friend Cengiz Güneş to my left. I'll give the floor to Cengiz.
Okay. Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you for coming to the talk. I hope you can hear me. I'm going to talk about the political representation of Kurds in Turkey, mainly during the AKP rule from 2002 to the present. And this is what I'm going to do. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the role political parties play in the representation of Kurds in Turkey. Then I'm going to look at the traditional structures and their role, traditional political actors, how their role has changed, and what role do they play now. So I'm going to look at the tribes and religious orders. Fine, and then I'm going to move on to modern classes. Kurdish society in Turkey is quite, it has undergone a lot of changes since 1960s. So there's a greater degree of urbanization. Many Kurds have moved to Western Turkey. They have increased education opportunities. So it has become more complex society, and I'm going to look at modern classes, and especially the role that business classes play and what kind of activities they get into. And then I'm going to talk about women and youth. Women are important because in the past 2 decades, pro-Kurdish parties especially have done a lot of work with increasing the representation of women. And as a result of that, they have increased the number of women who are active in the political parties, who are actively participating in politics. And I'm going to end by talking about the youth and the activities that they take part in, and what kind of inclinations that they have. Youth are also important because Kurdish movement in Turkey still heavily relies on sort of protests and demonstrations and sort of collective action, and youth play an important role in that process. Okay. Firstly, just a little bit of background. At the moment, the Kurdish population in Turkey is estimated to be between 15 to 20 million people. And They are mainly based in the southeastern regions, but also they have migrated to Western Turkey, and in places like Istanbul and the major cities of Turkey, there are quite a lot of Kurdish, quite strong Kurdish communities. And the case of Turkey and political representation of Kurds is quite complex and different than other cases, mainly because Turkey has been a democracy, some kind of a democracy, since 1950. And many Kurdish political actors have been part of the political establishment or political structures. So Kurdish, especially Kurdish tribal leaders and religious figures were elected as MPs, and they became part of the mainstream Turkish political parties. But that process has not produced a kind of a transformation in terms of increasing the Kurdish sort of issues that the Kurds want. So in a way, Kurds have been part of Turkey, but they have not been able to raise their demands for political rights. Those people who were representing the Kurds were very much they did not go beyond what was the legal limits. They very much stayed within the limits, and that created a situation where a lot of Kurds were not happy with what was happening in Turkey. So they then tried to address their demands through illegal, sort of clandestine parties. And this process began in 1960s onward, and the main political party in Turkey has been the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which was established in 1978, and it fought a guerrilla war from 1984 until the present. But during the 2000s, the noughties, they were long times when they did not fight. So they changed their demands from independent Kurdish state to accommodation of Kurdish rights within Turkey. Another main Kurdish political actor is the pro-Kurdish democratic movement, which was established in 1990, and it continues until the present. And throughout their history, they have been represented by different political parties, mainly because the state has repressed the movement and they closed down the political parties. And in order to continue the movement, the Kurds opened a new political party to replace it. And in addition, a large section of Kurdish population have been represented in the ruling Justice and Development Party, AKP. Many Kurds have voted for the AKP, although in the past 4 or 5 years, that trend has been on the decline. And I will talk more about that now. Okay, as you can see, this is a brief sort of history of the pro-Kurdish movement in Turkey. And between 1991 and 1994, there was a pro-Kurdish parliamentary opposition. But what happened is in 94, 93, the Turkish state repressed the movement, and they removed the immunity of the MPs and put many of them in jail. Others, in order to avoid persecution and prosecution, they moved to Europe. And as a result of that, from 1994 until 2007, there was not a pro-Kurdish parliamentary bloc in Turkey. The pro-Kurdish parties were taking part in elections, but they were not successful because they needed to get 10% of the overall vote. There was a 10% electoral threshold, but they have enjoyed a lot of success at the local level. They were running many of the municipalities, and they took that as a base, and they tried to build a larger pro-democracy movement, which resulted in the return of the pro-Kurdish parliamentary opposition in 2007. And in the past 2 years, 3 years, the pro-Kurdish party have done exceptionally well, especially the People's Democratic Party, the HDP. They won 13.1% of the vote, and they got 80 seats in the parliament. But the election was kind of cancelled because there was not an overall winner, and then the government, Erdogan, prevented a coalition. So there was a rerun of the election in which the votes were reduced, so were the seats. But currently, there are 59 pro-Kurdish MPs, but some of them have been, they had to leave Turkey, and some of them are in jail, as you mentioned, Anna, about Erdogan, Selahattin Demirtas, and all the kind of influential MPs are in jail. And the repression of pro-Kurdish movement continues, with also the mayor's removal from their place, and then they're replaced by appointed trustees, which are usually the district governor. So when we were doing the project, at the beginning, everything was kind of going well, and then now we're faced with a crisis of representation. So all the people that Kurds have voted have been, at the local level, removed, and all the political parties that they have voted for has been under repression, severe repression. Their MPs are in jail. Okay, this shows the votes that the pro-Kurdish party gained in 2011, and I'm comparing that to the elections in 2015. As you could see, there has been a significant increase. This is the provinces in which the Kurds are a majority. And in some places, for example, in Shirnak and Hakkari, they got something like 85% of the votes. Before 2015, they were not running they were not taking part in the election as a party. They were supporting independent candidates. So there was not a Kurdish candidate in every city, or pro-Kurdish candidate in every city. But what happened in 2015, they ran as a party, and that allowed them to vote, to field candidates in every province, and collectively increasing their votes. Because previously, if there was not a pro-Kurdish candidate, people couldn't have voted for them. So now everybody in Turkey was given a chance to vote for a pro-Kurdish candidate if they wanted. Okay, this is the picture of the Kurdish vote, the pro-Kurdish vote in Western Turkey. And as you can see, in places like Istanbul, they got more than 12% of the vote. They were the third party in Istanbul, and they had about 14 MPs. And Istanbul is a place where there are lots of Kurds, about 2 million, 3 million Kurds. But in other areas that they have taken part, in other big cities, there have also been an increase in the vote. And what do the HDP want? Now, firstly, they want a new constitution in Turkey to recognize ethnic and national pluralism in Turkey. And they want the Kurdish identity to be constitutionally recognized in Turkey. And they want all the national rights that Kurds have to be recognized. And that includes education and language, education in Kurdish language. And they want a new governance structure for Turkey, which they call democratic autonomy. And this is a kind of a framework of decentralization. And they want Turkey to be divided into something around 25 regions. And all these regions will be self-governing. So the Kurds in those regions will govern themselves. So a lot of the rights, these regions should have a lot of rights. For example, they should be able to define what languages should be used in the education, and that kind of thing. It's a little bit similar to what's happening in northern Syria, but HDP is a Turkey-focused party, so they don't emphasize so much Kurdish demands, but they want these things for all of Turkey, as well as recognition of cultural pluralism. Another thing that they have been campaigning about is gender equality, and they have included policies to advocate women's participation in politics and society. Around 25 MPs are women, and there's a co-chair system, so every elected position is shared by a man and a woman. Okay, now I'll talk about the Justice and Development Party. AKP has been quite successful in drawing support from the Kurds since 2002, mainly because the welfare party, before that, other Islamist parties such as the Welfare Party and the Felicity Party, they also performed well since 1990s. So the Islamist parties have been kind of the alternative to the Kurdish movement from 1990s onward. And the party has incorporated many Kurdish conservative Islamic sort of elements into its structures, and it has used the tribal networks, also religious networks, to mobilize votes. Also, AKP's Islamist ideology is also important in drawing support from the Kurds. And the EU accession process is also another factor that needs to be mentioned, because it led to a lot of democratic reforms being carried out, and that opened up a space for Kurds and civil society organizations, and AKP was able to say to the voters that it was genuinely interested in solving the Kurdish question. It gave the AKP a chance to portray itself as a party for the Kurds and party for everyone, and they were doing everything they could. So, and various other factors such as assistance programs, job offers of jobs or promises of jobs have also been used to win voters. Okay, I need to speed up because Fale is telling me. Okay, this is the AKP vote in 2002, which was the first election that AKP took part, and in 2007. Now, 2002, AKP was challenged by other conservative parties, but it managed to win most of the votes. It didn't do very, very well in other Kurdish areas, but you can see in 2007, it increased significantly. Okay, this is the figure for 2011 and 2015. You can see that in 2011 it did quite well, but in 2015 its votes were decreased significantly, and it was in 2011 AKP was saying that it was the main representative of the Kurds in Turkey, because more Kurds vote for the AKP than for the pro-Kurdish parties. But from 2015 onwards, that stopped being the case. And the reasons for AKP's loss is that there was the Gezi Park protests. AKP had this kind of image that it was for democracy, for tolerance. That image began to be lost after 2011 and 12, and it became more and more conservative, more and more authoritarian, and it kind of was not seen as a force for democracy and for progress. Also, AKP's choices, policy choices regarding the Syrian conflict is another important factor. It was kind of, it had a very antagonistic, very hostile position towards the Kurds in Syria. And many of the Kurds in Turkey, even if they don't support for the PKK or HDP, they still have an affinity towards Kurds in Rojava. And AKP couldn't calculate that their stance vis-à-vis the conflict in Syria will have an impact on their votes from the Kurds. And in 2015, AKP made HDP its main kind of target. It did everything it could to prevent them from surpassing the election threshold, so that they will not have a parliamentary representation, and all the votes that the AKP would be the second party in Kurdish region, and all the MPs would be AKP MPs. And that's why the pro-Kurdish party was also quite against AKP. They used that to mobilize its voters, and they were saying that they would be the only party to prevent Erdogan from becoming a dictator. And this is what Michael was talking about earlier, that they were going to prevent Erdogan becoming the president, but what they meant was a dictator rather than just a president. Okay, there are other political parties, but none of them have much success in terms of election results. And some of these political parties are linked to the Kurdistan Democrat Party in Iraq, and they're seen as their cronies, if you like, and they don't have support base, a big popular support base. And another party that is gaining more sort of votes is called Hüdapar, which is in English is known Free Cause Party, but Huda means kind of God in Kurdish and also in Farsi, I think. In a way, it's party of God. Is the people who supported Hezbollah in Turkey. Their followers established that. It's an Islamist jihadist party, but they haven't managed to get a lot of votes. Okay, I'm going to be very, very fast. This is about the tribes. The tribes were very influential in 1950s, but they lost a lot of their support base because of urbanization, socioeconomic changes. They were no longer able to mobilize votes. So from 80s onwards, the Kurdish movement became the main representative. But they are still part of this they're still actors, because from 1985 they began to reconstitute themselves as a military force in support of the state against the Kurdish insurgents. And that gave them a lot of economic power, and they used that economic power to increase their political power. And this is the attitudes of people that we interviewed. As you can see, a lot of people see political parties as their representative, and the reason for that is mainly because the tribal leaders are also active in those political parties. So through the tribal leader, the tribal leader uses political parties to get things done. So that's the explanation for that. But still, something around 20% of the people we have interviewed have stated the tribal chief as their main representative, and about 9% have said about the family being the main representative, and 16% have stated the state functionaries as their representative. This is the highest in the sample because I mentioned the village guards, and because these sections of society are the most integrated with the state, and they see the state functionaries as their representatives. And in a way, a similar story with the religious orders. They were quite influential, but throughout 50s, 60s, they were the main ones, the main political representatives. Then from 80s and 90s onward, they started to lose their influence. And with the rise of AKP, they have been able to kind of reconstitute their position as important actors, but they are very much dependent on AKP. They use their networks to get votes for AKP. So without the AKP, they may not be an independent, successful actors. And this is the picture for the religious Kurds. A lot of them see the cleric as their main representative, and political parties are quite high as well. That's because for long times the clerics and religious orders were influential within the political parties, the mainstream political parties in Turkey. Okay, modern classes Kurdistan. Kurdish region in Turkey is not a very rich region. It has been damaged, economy has been damaged by a lot of the conflict. But there are rich Kurds, business class, Kurdish business class, but most of them were in Western Turkey. So there are Kurdish business establishments in Istanbul and Ankara, and they operate across Turkey. And what happened in the past 2 decades, Kurds from the majority Kurdish regions also become to kind of, they established businesses and got rich and expanded their business activities. But it's very much a small group. There are some kind of Kurdish specific business associations and industrialists and those kind of organizations, but they're not very influential. The difficulty for the business classes is that they have to work with the government, because the government gives a lot of contracts and stuff like that. But also at the local level, the pro-Kurdish party is very strong, and so they have to work with the pro-Kurdish party as well. So in a way, they have to balance, and they're not able to do that very successfully. Okay. And this is the attitude. So they work with political parties and MPs. Many of the AKP MPs are also successful business people, and they have links with the community and business community. So in a way, personal ties are important for this group. And women, women have been an important part of Kurdish movement in Turkey from 1980s onward, but this has increased in the past decade. As a result of that, there are now more women MPs, more women representatives in the local level, political parties, and women's rights are part of the political program of the Kurdish party, pro-Kurdish party, and local governments, at the local government level, there are lots of policies that have been adopted to empower women and address grievances and demands. So there are like organizations which help with domestic violence, which offer free legal advice to women, and there are cooperatives which are supposed to sort of help women develop more economic independence and stuff like that. This was very much the case in the past, in sort of 2000 to 2015, but after 2015, women's rights organizations have also been a target of Turkish state repression. Many of them have been closed down. So, okay, so that's why for this, for women, NGOs are playing a big role. They see NGOs as their representatives, because there are many women's rights groups which actively work for empowerment of women. And okay, finally, the youth and student activism. Now this group is quite diverse. there are many kind of local level groups who have been part of this, part of the sort of PKK's structure, I feel like. There's a group called the Patriotic Revolutionary Youth Movement, the YDGH, and this was in the past, in the past decade, they have been quite active. Many of the protests they take part in, and they were a big part of the clashes in the urban centers in the post 2015 period, and clashes with the government forces. Also, the HDP has a youth branch, and there are lots of university kind of student organizations that are affiliated broadly with the HDP. So there are many organizations that are used to mobilize the youth, and in the past 2-3 years the youth have been very, very active, especially many of them have joined the Kurdish forces in Syria. They have been active in Kobane resistance and so on. Okay. Oops. Okay, conclusions. Now, in the period from 2012 to 2015, there was a big shift in Turkey in the public debate on the accommodation of Kurdish rights, and many people were thinking that this will lead to some kind of a settlement between the government and the PKK, and things will be normalized. But what happened is, since 2015, it got the reverse of that has happened, and the Kurdish question is now re-securitized. That the government sees the Kurds as Kurdish issues as a kind of a threat to security, and has taken measures to repress it. And all form of Kurdish dissent is repressed, which creates problems for Kurds to represent themselves. And there was a dialogue between the PKK and the AKP government, but for 2 years they were talking, but it never led to some sort of a serious development. It did not create a kind of a new policy framework. That's what needs to happen, and that's what was not done. Mainly because AKP's pro-Kurdish party's ideological rival. They don't want a democratic, gender egalitarian society. They want a conservative society, and Kurdish movement is against that. So they see Kurdish movement as something that needs to be kind of destroyed. Yeah. Okay. I have to stop here, but if you have any questions, we'll pick up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cengiz. Our second talk is by Said Abdul Razak. He's going to talk about statistical analysis of 4 cities in Iran. This is from the Governing Diversity Project headed by Professor Dr. Fala Jabbar. Saad.
As you know, I mean, this project, I mean, it is very huge. 4 countries, I mean, Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Turkey. I am not the author of this survey, this part of Iran. I will show it to you. I did only the statistical analysis of this part from a sample of 464 people. They are interviewed, and this is some results. I will show it to you. It can help to have an idea about the Kurds in Iran, especially. About the question about the identity of the sample, 65% they said they are Kurdish. By the way, I heard that all the people, they were Kurdish, but their identity, they, only 65% they said they are Kurdish. And 12 Musliman or Muslim, they said, Shia 7%, Iranian 10%. And there is also others. I didn't know who they are. We don't know, I mean. But it might be all those people, they might be a Kurdish. This is about the identity. We must keep this because it will help us to, in the future, this slides, we will see it. About the cities, this is 4 cities we did, the people they did the survey. It is Kermanshah, 29% of the sample, Sanandaj, 30%, Aramia, 17%, and Mohabad, 25%. As it is here, I think it's clear. After that, only I will show here one thing. The Kurdish sample in this area, these cities. And Kermanshah, those people who say they are Kurdish, it is 51%. In Sanandaj, 55%. In Mohabad, 78%. And in Aramia, Ormia, it is 83%. Sex is 30, the gender, division, female 31% and male 69. The age group, less than 20 years, only 5%. 20 to 29, 25%. 30 to 39, 31%. 40 to 49, 20%. And more than 50s, they are 19, which is, only the less than 20% they are in minority. Well, we will go to others. Education, 45% illiterate. I am sorry for yesterday because I thought it was 49. It is 44. There is some other, they didn't respond. And non-respond also, it is 1% or 2%. Intermediate, 3%, the people who got intermediate. And there is, sorry. First of all, I will start with the primary. Primary school, the people who go to primary school, it was 1% of the sample. The who got intermediate, which is mutawassita in Arabic, it is 3%. Secondary school, 8%. Degree, BSc, degree, Jami'iyya, it is 17%. And PhD and master degree, more than the BSc, it is 17%. Well, we go to others. Occupation. Occupation, well, the big, it is private jobs, we can say, not only business. People, a'mal harra, people who, they have business or something, but private, not for government. This is the main thing. Non-employed, it is unemployed. It is 28%. Civil servants, who work in the to the government, they are 13%. Others, of course, there is something. Civil society, 2%. And here, academics, Jami'i, because it was, it is 3% or so, and the student, 3% as a student. This is about the occupation. If we go further, the income of people, less. This is a problem I've been in Middle East because nobody gives the real his income. I don't know. Maybe they are afraid from the taxes or something like that. Of course, before I analyzed this, I thought that it will be the majority less than $500 a month. 40. That's why it's 46. And then 500 to 1,000, it is 36, the second, and 1,000 to 2,016, and more than 3,000, it is less than 1, it is 1%. And now it is the first, there is a question, they, answer it, it's about the freedom of expression, which is, one of the main questions in this survey. People who feel in Mahabad, they are, yes, the current government give us the freedom of expression only 14% percentage. And Oromia, it is 21% or 22, let us say. And Sandalaj, it is 24. And in Kermanshah, it is the, 31%. They said the current government give us freedom of expression. For the Kurds who say they are Kurds, only 11% they said that this government is give them freedom of expression. Muslim is more, 33%. They say the people who said they are Iranian, 55%, and the more is Shia. Of course, there are 7%, by the way, Shia, who say that, but it is 81% more. We can have something of this. Male, and this is, for the sex, it doesn't play here anything, because there is no, the male is about 20%, they said, yeah, this the government, and the female, they said, less than 30% or 32%. They said that they have this freedom of expression, the government. That's why in the sex, it doesn't help, it doesn't give anything, because it is nearly always, it is not a big difference between male and female about many issues. The other things, here we have the age, if it is play. If you look to this, can I have to this figures, usually when it is only this one can play something. People more than 50, but here it is the same. It doesn't help us. There is no connection. Only this one, a little bit, it is not more. But that's why they said about the age, it doesn't play in this question about the freedom. People more than, they say they are 36%, they got, it is not a big deal, if you look at it. Here is also a little bit the same. People here with the primary, with the education. They have primary about 25%, and people with the university, they have PSC, only 43%. Intelligent. Master degree and PhD, it's 17, and illiterate, 26. That's why, here we can say something, but the other is, the same level. Let us now go to here, another figure. Yes, the government give us a freedom. The students, 0. They didn't, they said they don't have at all. It's 100% of the students, they don't have freedom of expression. After that, the academics came. After that, civil society, people who work in the civil society, those people in private business or job, non-employed, civil servant, they are in the government already, and the military is the most, and it is gives a little bit, it gives, I mean, quite, there is a relationship between these figures. We go further, people with income, more than 2,000, I mean, here, if you take it, there is no, I mean, in this group, less than 2% or 3%, no more. That's why it is, they are very happy with the freedom of expression, but still, I mean, they are not, we can't say. The other figure, it is in one line. There is no relationship in this figure. That's why I mean, only here, it is those people, I mean, it's about not 1%, let us say 2 or 3% only. It doesn't, I mean, how does it? Okay, I will go further. The others are, when now about political representation, I mean, the Turkish, you did also about representation. Who represent which institution or which kind of institution represented the people on this? It's a little bit shocking. I mean, it is. Let us take political parties. This is for the Kurdish, Muslim, Shia, and Iranian, about the people who ID, their ID. There is a big, the Kurdish, I mean, 37%, they said that the political party represented them. This is a good figure. And after that, the Muslim it goes down. Here with Shia, it means this is very good. I mean, we can talk about it. The Kurdish, it means mainly they have the political party in this session. And this is political party, and this is red, family. Religion personality. No, I think no. But religion doesn't have it. It is the family. I think the family. Let us. I will see it here. Yeah, religious personality. Sorry, religious personality. Here, the Kurds is nothing. About 2.3%, let us say 2%. It means for the Kurdish, doesn't mean anything. By the way, we must, 65% of our Rada, they are Kurdish. They say they are ID, they are Kurdish. It means the majority, they don't, for them. For the Muslims, and it is obvious, I mean, because they are Muslim religious people, it is for them, it's very quiet. And it goes there, and after that, who said Iranian also, it is not Hada, which is, but of course, all the people, I mean, the Kurdish is 65, I mean, the others is about 35% or something like that. And here, the other things, I mean, the MP, there's a question, it doesn't play anything because it is the same. Always it is the same. Here we have political party and religious people. Yeah, this is okay, we can talk about it. And the other, it is nearly in one line. That's why, I mean, they are not, yeah, but it is still, it is not very big deal. From 25 to 12, yeah, it is something, we can't talk about it, but it is not a big deal. I mean, you can see it. It is nearly, I mean, the same, but still, we can here or there. It depends on the author of this project, how they will, explain such figures. Male and female, I don't think it is a big deal also. Yeah, about the political party, a little bit the male is more than female, It go down with the civil society. Civil society to the female, it is more. And here, family, of course, female, it is obvious also. And the male, it goes down. And here it is no one, because there is a question. If they don't have anything, it is nearly by. Well, here it's about, a political party. Here, it is very obvious.
Age group.
Yeah, it is age group. For people 40, 49, for them the political party is about 40% from this group. They said the political party is, they represent them. And the others, it's here a little bit, less than 20, which is, it's 5% of the, not very, it is less than 5%. They said also a little bit, but otherwise, this goes, yeah, here and there we can't talk about it, but this is the result. If we go to the education, there is here zero, yeah. But political party, and this is, the result for the people who got primary school, for them, I don't know how we can explain this figure. 40% from people who are the primary, finished primary, they said the political party. After that, it goes with, I don't know also why, with intermediate.
The primary to the age group. Perhaps those have only primary school education, but they are of the
Yeah, this is your job. You will you put it. Yeah, you can, because
It's your job. No,
yeah, with political party, I thought the academics, master degree.
Those who have primary school education, look at the age group. Which age group?
Yeah, that's right.
And then you will see that.
Yeah, okay.
You see,
This is
of the age group that prefers political party.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, it needs such thing. I did. I have it somewhere, but I will do it. Yeah, this is good. This is good. This is and here is secondary. You will see it. It goes up and down, and here everything. It gives out, but it needs here to do, as you said. It's very important, and I can do it, of course. But I was, in a hurry. I did it very good. And here is the other things. But this is a good hand. And about the, this is with jobs. You can see it. The more is private. With the political parties. The other here is nearly, it is not very, deal, but here is, it is obvious. And this one is the first degree. It is family. The academics, the academics, yeah. This is the family. They trust the family more than represent them. The family, not the other. Which is, it needs, as you said. And here is the, it doesn't really, the income doesn't, there is some, of course, up and down, but it doesn't, change anything from this figure or something like that. And we go, I think it is finished here, activity. And there is a question about which initiatives and to achieve a Kurdish representation for all of the if there is here up, I mean you can see it. How can I put it down?
You have media, you have negotiations, peaceful protest.
No, there is more. Yeah, media. Yeah, media. Yeah, media. There's 5. Media. No, it's okay.
Negotiation with the government.
Yeah, it is 40% here for the Shiites. They said that media campaign, it will represent the Kurdish. And the Kurdish, it is less, of course.
Not the Kurds, represent them.
To present the Kurdish. Oh, not them. The question, I have it here in Arabic also.
It's okay.
Yeah, but for the, I mean, yeah. If you want to, yeah, about your, yeah, if you want, and there is,
yourself as a Shiite.
yeah, and there is another question, the same, about which initiative.
I'm not asking him if you as a Kurd.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
asking if you.
Yeah, okay.
You, if you say I am a Shiite, then you respond as a Shiite.
Yeah, yeah.
If you see yourself as a Kurd, you respond as a Kurd.
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, this is, I mean, the explanation. Well, okay, here we have, I mean, this
so they
is...
are comfortable, because they are Shiite, they are comfortable with the media.
Yeah.
Others are not.
Yeah, that's right. I agree with you. I mean, it gives such explanation. And here you will see it.
What about peaceful protest? Look at peaceful protest.
Peaceful, it is red, nothing.
The highest is Kurdish,
The highest is,
and the lowest is Iranian and Shia.
yeah. Yeah, Iranian, she
That makes
is,
sense.
yeah, the Kurdish, Muslim, it gives sense.
Huh?
It gives sense. Yeah, the Kurdish because but if you took this percentage about that, it is not a big deal. Yeah, it is, by the way. You can see it from when it is like, okay. We go further. This is about the, there is a difference between really Aramia, I mean, it goes, which is this negotiation with government, more than other things. And it goes here. About the first, this media campaign, all of they respond the same, nearly up and down, but it is not a big figures between them. Whenever it is a big one going up and the second down, it means there is some connection. You can, this is for sure. I mean, even in the, if you take the correlation between them or coefficient, there is some. But when it is all they are the same or nearly the same, there is no connection between them. Well, we go further. This is the about the sex. Doesn't play anything. I mean, you can't say anything. There is a big deal. And here, the people who are more than, the age, more than 50 years, it is a big. They choose the. Negotiation with government, and it gives a little bit because those people, 50 and more, they have some experience and with maybe with negotiation and such things. That's why it is. But if you see the other here, those people they are only 5% of the sample, but still they have something, and other they are the same. You can't say anything about them. And here the education, it's going. Here, 50% interview. We must, try, as you said, Fala. Yeah, we will analyze more to see which group with them who said this was because intermediate and primary school we can't, I mean, why they are choose such things? What is their, I mean, age group? What is their income or such a thing? I mean, otherwise it gives sense at least. It needs, I mean, more to do it, and I will do it for sure because I want the answer also. And here, civil. This is the I mean, occupation. Occupation. There is a different. Students 0. About this. This is negotiation with the government. And the military, of course, they are going up. And here also which is pressure group. This is for the first time, I mean, it came here. Because some figures I didn't brought them when it is edited. This pressure group for the civil society and such things. People who are, I mean, the civil society. If we go more, this is, this is the, it is not a big deal because more than 2,000 very little people. I mean, if you take it like that, there is only here, which is a negotiation with government, people from 500 to 2,000 nearly, they choose negotiation with government.
It's good news. The hard copies of the survey we smuggled over the border and we have it.
What you?
Biggest smuggler.
Okay.
So I mean, you had so many difficulties because they were photographed. We couldn't read some of these.
I can't.
Some of them are corrupt and.
So I have it in mind. It's very. I mean.
It's 500 plus.
Yeah, and Mac it is better than of course.
The old one is 240. So we have 2 surveys.
Okay.
8 months between.
Yeah.
And you can see the difference.
Yeah, and after that, the results, and I talk about it, I think. Thank you very much.
Just one word, all these surveys that you did, you will have them in a separate way. We'll have the hard copies and do all the...
I've sent everything to you. I've sent everything to you. Yeah.
Q&A?
That's it. If you have any questions,
we have a brief period for Q&A. Does anybody have a question or comment to either of the two speakers?
I mean, you saw the kind of survey that we have. It's detailed, meticulous. Usually it raises questions. And this kind of quantitative approach would raise a lot of qualitative questions. Why is this? Why is that? Why do those people this? I always give this example that in one survey we had people with income of $5,000 or $400 a month, and they say they are unemployed. So we thought, oh gosh, do they have like property, capital investment? What do they have? And then it turned out they work for companies, private companies. So if they are not in a government employment, they consider themselves unemployed. That's the conception in Iraq. And it led us to a new research project actually about this concept. Why is it there? How to resolve it? How to go beyond it? It was really instructive. Now, may I welcome Christine Anderton.
Van den Toorn.
Toren or Torn?
It's Van den Toorn. Yeah.
Torn.
Well, it's Dutch. So.
Okay. She's our colleague, and she's a wonderful researcher and a wonderful administrator. Works at the American University in Suleimania, AUS. Robert Talat is an MA holder. He's a young researcher. He worked with our institute since he was a BA student. And he has some, don't look at him, he's too young. He has 2 books to his name about the youth in Kurdistan and the political behavior, electoral behavior. They have just, they are so fresh. Rinad saw the whole, what do you call it, the emotional, festive kind of reception of the referendum, then the fears and the changing mood, etc. He will talk about that. And Christine will give us, I read her piece in Carnegie, I recommend you to read it. It's part of our collection on the crisis. Now we have more than 57 pieces ready. We will put them all on our website. It's an archive. It has become an archive, and it's very important. And she will talk also. I mean, I asked her to talk for 10 minutes. She said no, 5 to 7. I hope you would encourage her to go beyond 10. She has details of the details on the referendum. I know it's ladies first, but shall we give, it's okay? All right, okay.
Thank you. I would like to talk about very briefly about what happened before the 25th of September and what happened after that, or to be more accurate, to what happened after 16th of October. After the operation started on Kirkuk by the Iraqi forces and Hashd al-Sha'bi. So as a very general note about the Kurdish culture is known that it has a very carnival component in this kind of days, like in our national days, in this kind of a very national events, such we had like a referendum. So this have been used by political parties in a very intensively, in a very creatively way to mobilize people to celebrate of the big achievement which was supposed to come, of a big dream which was about to become true, as a dream of have a sovereign Kurdistan, a sovereign country on our homeland, which have been Kurds are struggling for this dream from many decades, and the de facto that we had, the very high de facto that we had before that time, motivated our leaders and motivated our people to believe that this dream is around to come true. And we are just far one step from this big achievement.
Independence.
Independence, yes. Unfortunately, what happened after that, so I just want to talk about this period, this small period before 25th of September, that the sense of nationalism was very high between people, and the sense of to be proud of being Kurd and to be proud of being going to decide about yourself, your future, was in a very high level, and was also being used by parties and by media to promote for this kind of behavior between people. And what happened after that? We saw that after 25th of September. Also. Not all Kurds, also even with the referendum, before the referendum, the people on the street have been divided between yes and no for now. So it was not no, it was no for now. So it means that it was a bit tricky, like they wanted to say that it's not a good time, it's not a correct time to say yes for such a dream. Time is not come yet. So that movement was especially based in Suleimania, and they were they've been supported by a big media and a big televisions and satellite, a big media campaign they had, and they had also a very big effect on Suleimania. And for Erbil and Duhok, where they are dominated by PDK, they also, the sense of nationalism was very high. And so everybody had to talk about the Kurdish flag and the Kurdish identity and the Kurdish sovereignty. So all of this after 25 of September started to change step by step when after the first speech of Barzani, when he said that we didn't do a referendum to say that we are going to separate, to declare, to make an independence declaration. We just did the referendum, and we are open to unconditional negotiation with Baghdad. We are open to start the negotiations. So it made the street, it made people to just take a look at what's happening around and what we did, what was those emotions, where did all of these emotions went, and what happened to our vote. People first question started to ask about this question, and then the game has changed, and the sense of being nationalist and the sense of being proud to the sense of achievement and the sense of success started to convert to the sense of darkness and to the sense of anxiety between people, especially after 16th of October, when the operation started on Kirkuk. So after this operation started on Kirkuk, I would like to just mention some points. The first one is that the main problem here now in Kurdistan, what's happening now, the Kurdish leaders are losing their legitimacy because of the many like bad ruling before, and because of the many corruption that we had before, and people were very disappointed about what they have seen with this elite, with this representation, with the political representation in Kurdistan. And on the other side, the internal conflict is a very big, and Kurdistan is also being divided to what they call a green zone in Suleymania and the yellow zone in Duhok and Erbil. So they've been divided. The divide and division between those two parts are very obvious and very announceable. So and also sometimes they talk about the civil war is on approach also. So. This is a very like a very negative sense right now we are living in, and the people are very people being very sensitive about what's happening in these days. About Erbil and Duhok, many people, especially in those two cities, they feel like they lost their dream. They feel like they've been lost what they've been dreaming about, and they feel like everybody turned his back to Kurd, and Kurds are not have ally anymore, and they are returning back to the old saying, which says that the only friends of us are our mountains. So this is a very this code was about to disappear because we were people even on the street were very proud of having America or international community as a ally, especially during the ISIS war. Right now, people started to talk about that the only friends of us are our mountains. Another point also I would like to mention here that is also for Erbil and Duhok especially, there is still many people see what's happening now, it's a kind of tactic. They don't want to accept the reality. They are also they're speaking about that what's happening now. It's not possible from our allies to let that a proxy war. They call it a proxy war, a proxy government like Abadi's government, who's doing a proxy war against Kurdistan, to continue like that, and they don't intervene. It's not possible for America to don't intervene, and it's a kind of tactic. And they are watching this, what's happening in the next few weeks and the next months. But I can say that they are kind of sure that this game will change very soon, and the balance will change, and they are watching the international community behave to intervene in this process and to change the balance in favor of Kurds.
You told me also that some people say, well, let the Hajj come So that
Yeah,
we have
this is
some
what
overview.
what I want to talk about here, and this I will try to make it the last point. Yeah, and also, yeah, so with all of these negative points and disappointments between people on the street, also there is some hope between people, or many people we can say, to be like, especially in Suleimania or around Suleimania, which has been affected by the big campaign of oppositions, which is Suleimania always been a base, a very fundamental base for many opposition parties like the Change Movement, also PUK, so also the new generation that the new, which is the new parties around, it's about to be participate in the next elections. So those people believe that it could be what's happening now, the returning back of Baghdad, returning back of power of central government to Kurdistan could be a chance for people. It could be advantages for us to get finished for what we have seen with the Kurdish government, for what we have seen with the bad policy and the unclear policy, petrol policy, and corruption, and no salaries. So they see that it's a big chance if we see that those elite, those political representation, if they get weaker, it gives us, on the other side, it gives us a chance for those people, for the Kurdish citizens, to make their life better, to receive their salaries, and to change the economic condition, the economic issues in general in Kurdistan through better. So I think, I hope I haven't forget anything. So that's
Okay,
the main
thank you
point.
very much.
Thanks.
Yeah, as you see, I mean, the mood was changing really from euphoric to questioning, concern, then to doom and gloom. Some people are trying to, it's like Freudian, like escape. You know? No, things are, it could be tactic, could be like this will change. And, that happens at times of stress. Now, floor is yours. Okay, I'm finished. Sorry.
So I did not know that I was going to speak today, so I'm sorry if my points are maybe disorganized. But I guess I'll just maybe review a few of what I thought were the main takeaways from the referendum, which didn't make it into a lot of international media or reporting. And I mean, these takeaways say a lot about, I mean, they reflect opinion and politics in Kurdistan, Iraqi Kurdistan, over the past, decade, and also what's happened since the referendum, because, there were a lot of divisions before the referendum. I mean, this euphoric mood was really isolated to, well, I wouldn't say isolated, but it was in Erbil and Dohuk. I mean, you wouldn't, I was in Suli. You wouldn't have known that there was a referendum happening in Suli even a day before. I mean, even the day of. I mean, it was just a non-issue, really. And, I work at the American University there, so whenever I talk to our students and just friends about it, the overwhelming kind of response, or the most common response, is just like kind of cynicism, doubt, cynicism, why would I ever go vote, these kinds of things. So, and I did spend some time, a week, 2 weeks in July and August in Erbil before, and I mean, as you all know, the mood in Erbil was completely different, and I was there 2 weeks before the referendum when all the posters are going up. So, and this reflects the, historic and recent, divide among the Kurds, among the political parties. I mean, really this Suli, or PUK, Suli, not everyone in Suli is PUK, right? This rejection of Barzani, not my president. That's been going on for a long time. It didn't just start before the referendum. So I think, before the referendum, there were a lot of divisions, and this really showed up on election day or referendum day. So just a few points because, and just to mention, the Kurdistan High Electoral Commission, the name is longer than that, but I can't remember the other ones there. I mean, they have not even released the results on district and provincial level. And this should be a huge issue because I would speculate that there's a reason they're not releasing those. So we haven't put this out yet because we're still collecting all of the unofficial results, and we also did have some moles in the different KHEC offices. So the policy center at AUIS at the university, we had a lot of our students and researchers go out and collect all that they could from their sources. And these are from off-the-record official sources and unofficial sources. You'll see that in Soleimani, you had 50%, 55% turnout, same as Halabja, and all the towns in Soleimani province were similar. I mean, I had people tell me it was actually 30. I have no way of verifying that, but I'm just saying, like, this, even 50 or 55 is debatable. I'm sure some people would say it was more. Some people have told me it's less. So, and I would just explain that. I think,
We have footage of,
Right, and
a civil servant ticking, yes, just like very quickly.
Yeah, and again, this is so hard to say this. And I think that I would, as a side note, I mean, I covered the 2013, 2014 elections. I was in Suli as well as in 2009 and 10. And we had teams out at all of the polling stations and highly documented the methods of fraud. So I, of course, I can't say, I saw it, but the reports in the referendum were also there especially about ballot stuffing. Maybe not quite as much as in the previous elections, because those were like the party elections and there was, I wouldn't say more at stake, but when the parties are involved, especially with Goran, there was a ton of fraud because so much was at stake. So I think, and they haven't released the results. There are a lot of reports of ballot stuffing. So, and I mean, there was no international election monitoring body. I mean, this is a really significant point. The UN did not endorse it. No NDI, Carter Center, blah, blah, blah. No one was there. So I think, that's also something to keep in mind. And I think the low turnout also, I think there are a couple things. I mean, number one, a lot of people were saying no for now, and there was this yes, but vote. So you had there was also a huge shift in the 3 months before the election to the days before. And I mean, when I was out there on referendum day, I knew that a lot of the predictions that we had all had, that like the turnout was going to be very low and the no vote was going to be very high, I knew that was going to be off because I could sense people at the polling stations that it became very emotional in the week before because of the international opposition and because people just can't say no. So they either voted yes or they didn't vote. So I think that was significant. And so just to say everyone went and they voted yes, and that means they want independence is just, I mean, right now, as you were saying, is just, it needs to be further qualified. I think, the other thing is I already mentioned the massive Erbil-Suli divide, the low turnout, the yes but vote, and also the massive political divisions among the elites. Everyone was saying, oh, this is so beautiful. Look at the Kurdish elites and parties and leaders have finally come together, when really, I mean, there was incredible divides in the weeks and months before the referendum, which were then reflected in what happened after the referendum in Kirkuk. So you had different members of the family of the PUK and even of the Barzanis either not saying anything or saying one thing to one group and one thing to another. And then you have Shaswar's no for now. I mean, so you had many different dynamics. There was no consensus until the days before, when, of course, you can't vote no to Kurdish independence and continue as a Kurdish or Kurdish Iraqi leader. So Those were kind of my main points, and just about the referendum results. And I think we just, none of what happened after should have been a surprise, because this is all a continuation of the divisions, on a kind of political, between the elites and the people, and between the political parties that have no mechanisms for solving these disputes. It's all the person or the party or the family. There are no mechanisms for consensus or making deals and settlements. So, yeah, I don't know. If there are any questions, maybe.
That's very kind. Thank you
sorry.
very much. Thanks, Christine. I want to, stress one point, which is really important at this juncture. The right-wing Shia bloc in Baghdad is agitating to end federalism as a structure, as a political order. And they are agitating for this. I know from, there are legal and constitutional constraints. First, we need to have, the constitution amended, which requires a quorum of 2/3 of the parliament, which is impossible to get. And then majority in any three provinces can simply fail it. So it's a long process. But at the moment, the end result is creating popular animosity between Arabs and Kurds. It's for the first time. Saad Abdulrazak was the first guy to be arrested in the anti-government demonstrations calling for peace with the Kurds. In Baghdad, he was beaten up and arrested, and myself, I took part in some demonstrations of the sort and some activities of the sort long ago. And I think this pro-peace kind of activity needs to be re-enlivened one way or another. The Peace Council in Baghdad is like silent, dead silent. They are saying nothing, and there is no initiative. And for the first time, this kind of anti-Kurdish attitude was actually, it was confined to the government, not to the people. People were always, one way or another, it's not entirely against it, they're not with it, they are not supportive of it. So there has been some changes, and one of the factors is this bloc that I call right-wing Shiism. It's very active, day and night. They're talking about it. They have at their disposal, I don't know, 30 to 35 TV networks, radio stations, apart from religious networks and party networks and social networks. It's a real thing. You can see it on the social media. It's very evident. It's alarming, simply because there is no counter measure. There must be some sort of an initiative for peace, in a way, one way or another. If you have any questions for Christine, any questions? Okay, I wish to thank everybody, really. It has been a wonderful day and disastrous day all at the same time. So we had 4 other conferences around, and that took the wind out of our sails to some extent. And for tomorrow, we are having a session at Carnegie. It will start at 4, so people who wish to attend should be there like 20 minutes earlier. For the guests, they need to be like half an hour earlier. The trip from the hotel to there at that time, it requires 40 minutes or so. It's because of the traffic. So I would kindly ask you to be there wherever you are, wherever you go, 10 to 3, a quarter to 3, to be ready at the hotels, at the hotel downstairs. We will have some cabs and we'll go there all together. Thank you very much, Christine. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.